Ancient lost artifacts, legendary weapons, armor, jewelry, and little bits and bobs, strange devices, manuscripts written in unknown languages, and just stuff, for lack of a better word, of tales and legends. We will explore all of these artifacts and more, so if you're watching this, grab a drink. My choice today is English tea with a little bit of maple syrup in, and while you're here, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you like this sort of thing, as I am trying to hit 1 million subscribers by the end of today. But join me as we explore the legendary artifact Iceberg. To start off tier 1, we have the Ark of the Covenant. So this is something that most likely everyone has heard of before, hence it being in the first tier, but it was and has been a fascinating mystery for millennia now. And it was basically a storage box or a chest built by the Israelites, and this was at God's instruction with God's specifications for the box, and Moses was instructed to build this ark to a length of 2.5 cubits with a width of 1.5 cubits and also a height of 1.5 cubits. Now I know what you're asking, what the hell is a cubit? But it was basically an old type of measurement, and in modern units that's like 52 inches length by 31 inches height by 31 inches depth. And I know what you might be saying, Connor, we don't all use inches, can't you just use a normal measurement like everyone else? And okay, fine. It was about 13 tailless gerbils in length and about 7 3/4 tailless gerbils in height and depth. And it had to be made out of acacia wood. Then it was to be covered or gilded in gold, have these 4 golden rings attached at either end of it, with these 2 gold-covered poles put through the holes. And then with these poles, you'd be able to, carry the ark without actually touching it. And as far as touching the ark goes, I mean, what are you, stupid? Of course you can't touch it. Anyone who touched the ark in the Bible was instantly struck down by the wrath of God. You touch it, just die instantly on the spot. And the Israelites at the time, after they built the ark, they kind of used it to transport and store all of their most important artifacts. And so the artifact of the ark, the legend of it, isn't just the ark itself, it's also everything inside of the ark. And I realize there might be some confusion between Noah's ark and Moses's ark. This ark was a chest, Noah's ark was a giant boat. Very different things. But this ark was kind of used to inspire the Israelites. It was kind of a symbol of their power and right to be and do whatever they were being and doing. And they took it on them through these long treks in the desert and the wilderness. And if you were a poor, struggling Israelite in the desert at the time, you would probably see this ark, this gleaming, golden, holy thing, and it would probably give you some hope, some inspiration, and apparently it also granted them protection. So you can imagine it channeling the power of God, and while they were out in the wilderness, it gave them protection. When they were crossing rivers, it sometimes, parted the river a little bit. And they famously took the ark to the siege of Jericho, which there is some evidence to suggest that Jericho was already destroyed by the time the Israelites got there. But according to the biblical account, the Israelites went to Jericho, and Jericho had these huge impenetrable walls. But after taking the ark and marching around the city 6 times, accompanied by 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets, as soon as they completed the 7th rotation around Jericho, instantly the walls just collapsed. And then the Israelites were able to, go into Jericho and basically invade, kill the Jerichonians, take over the city, and the legend says it was all thanks to the power of this ark. And if you notice, there's quite an importance on the number 7 there. And the ark in these stories kind of pops up here and there. It is quite fun to track kind of where it is at any one given point in time. But in one of these accounts, the Israelites lost the Battle of Ebenezer, and my pronunciation is uncertain on that one, but they lost the battle versus the Philistines, which was another tribe, another group of people back then. And the Philistines worshipped these pagan gods such as Dagon and Astarte. And interestingly enough, we actually get the name Beelzebub from one of the Philistine gods. So the Israelites basically took the god of another person and then made it into a name for the devil in their religion. So that was kind of interesting. But the Philistines were quite a warlike people. They were strong, they were competent, they were hard-headed, and they may have actually originated from another peoples which we covered before, the remnants of the Sea people. And so the Israelites lost this battle, and as a secret tactic, as this backup weapon they had. They brought to the next battle the Ark. And surely with the power of God in this Ark, they couldn't lose, which means, of course, that they did lose that battle. And the Philistines killed a bunch of the Israelites, they took the Ark for themselves, and the Israelites in this battle lost an estimated 30,000 soldiers, which is an insane amount of people to lose, especially for the populations back then. But when word that the Ark was captured got back to the other Israelites, apparently one of the elder priests, Eli, just instantly dropped dead, like on the spot. But the Philistines, while celebrating their victory, found that wherever they stored the Ark, bad things happened. You know, there was either mass destruction of their gods' statues, or plagues or illnesses came over a bunch of people in certain areas, and they kept just moving the Ark. Bad things would happen over here, then they moved it again, more bad things would happen, and so they were like, this is ridiculous, we just can't get rid of this curse. And so they eventually handed it back to the Israelites after only 7 months, and again, there's that 7 number. But they gave it back to the Israelites along with these golden statues as a way of saying, like, hey buddy, we're sorry about taking the Ark, sorry about killing thousands of your people, here's some gold to make up for it. And it should be noted that this account comes from the Hebrew Bible, so it is most likely at least a little bit biased. But the Ark kind of stays around for a few more years until it is eventually housed in Jerusalem. And during the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587 BC, the city was more or less burnt, and the whereabouts of the Ark after this are seemingly completely unknown. The three main beliefs or theories is that the Babylonians either took it back to Babylon, or the people of Jerusalem hid the Ark somewhere in Jerusalem, maybe in a secret underground vault, or perhaps just buried it underground, as they were being sieged for like 3 years, so they did have plenty of time to really hide it if they wanted to. And so in this theory, it's still somewhere beneath Jerusalem, as it wasn't taken away and it wasn't destroyed. Or a third theory says that they smuggled it out of the city at some point during the siege, and they took it to who knows where. Some theories say they took it down to Africa through Egypt. Others say they took it up into Europe, so it's either in Spain or France or maybe even over an island. And others say they took it somewhere into Asia, which I think might be the most far-fetched theory, because they didn't really have any safe connections in which to, you know, transport it up there and to bury it or house it somewhere that it hasn't turned up by now. And yeah, stuff like this is always a super fascinating topic for me. I can and have gone down into the rabbit hole for this for like hours on end. So if you like stuff like this, firstly, stay tuned. Secondly, go on a rabbit hunt of your own if you want. But yeah, we have no idea where the Ark is or if it even still exists to this day. The Philosopher's Stone. So this was this ancient mythical item, sometimes in the form of a powder or liquid, but most often in the form of a stone, and it could transform these boring base metals like, you know, zinc, copper, mercury. It could transform them into gold and silver. And as well as that, it could also prolong life, cure illnesses or ailments, cure plants or trees, transform basically normal boring crystals into rare gems, and some of my favorite abilities, create flexible glass, everlasting lamps, and tiny clone people, which, I mean, that is one hell of a stone. But this was basically the ultimate goal or aim for all alchemists for like thousands of years. And the earliest mention of this stone goes all the way back to around 2000 BC. And many alchemists, especially religious ones, believed that the stone's first ever owner and user was actually Adam from the Bible, and that he received this knowledge and this stone from God. And with this stone, he was able to prolong life, and that explains why so many of the people in the Bible live for like really, really long. And then it was passed down generation to generation until maybe it slowly started to lose some of its power, or it eventually got lost, and then it just faded away into a thing of legends, kind of like the One Ring in Lord of the Rings. And the Philosopher's Stone, or something very similar to it, has seen mentions in loads of religions, from Christianity to Islam, Judaism, but also notably Hinduism, but also in many, many cultures. But the fact remains, if it ever did exist, if it still exists to this day, we have no idea where it is. The Holy Grail was the cup or grail that Jesus supposedly drank out of during the Last Supper before his execution. And according to the account, this grail wasn't like anything special. It wasn't like a golden grail filled with gems or something. It was just a normal, boring cup. But what made it special was that Jesus himself used it. And while it has been rumored to have popped up all over the place throughout the years, with lots of people claiming that they have the real genuine grail, there's no super concrete evidence to say that it even existed or to say that it still exists today. And if it does exist today, there's no evidence to say which one of these claims is actually the real one. So a very cool artifact, but we may never find it. Jesus's burial cloth, or the Shroud of Turin, was this cloth said to date back to the time of Jesus, and it had this vague image or outline of Christ, which apparently can be seen more easily when the image is turned negative and the contrast is bumped up a whole bunch. But according to the legend, this cloth was wrapped around Jesus at the time of his death, and he was buried in it in his tomb, and his blood is what caused this holy image to appear. There is, however, some evidence to suggest that this cloth was made in the 12 or 1300s, and the blood is not blood, but rather red pigment. But it is still an ancient relic of our past. Excalibur, and oh boy, this is a fun one. And the whole Merlin, Arthur, Excalibur myth first officially started round about the 1200s with Robert de Boron's French poem titled Merlin, in which Merlin in the story tells the tale of Arthur, who comes along and pulls this sword out of an anvil on Christmas Eve, and with that becomes the true and rightful king of the Britons. But there are so many texts and tales and stories about this round about this time, you know, like the 1100s up to the 1400s, in which the tale of Arthur and Excalibur are seemingly slowly built up bit by bit all over the place, with the prophecies of Merlin being written in the 1100s, followed by a reference to his full name being Merlinus Ambrosius, and this links back to an old man, wizard, sage sort of character that was mentioned 300 years before this in the year roughly 900, named Ambrosius. So the idea of Merlin dates back at least this far. And there's a 6th century Welsh reference to a crazy old man prophet named Merlin, written in, you know, Celtic Welsh. And this seems to be where the name Merlin was derived from, you know, the 6th century, but it likely goes back even further than that, maybe before it was named Merlin at all. I'm sure the wise old man myth has been around for millennia. So then we come to the story of Merlin telling about Arthur pulling the sword out of the anvil, and at this point it wasn't Excalibur, and then in later retellings it becomes Excalibur that was pulled out of the anvil, which by this point the story has evolved to be pulling out of a stone, and then in some versions of the story Excalibur is the sword that is given to Arthur by the lady in the lake, and the name Excalibur itself comes from the names Caliburnus or Chaliburn, or the Celtic Welsh Calad Forch. So Arthur, Merlin, Excalibur, they all have these ancient origins. We can't really pinpoint it to any one, you know, point. But the sword itself is said to possess the power of light, blinding enemies whenever it's drawn. And the scabbard, or sheath, or sword holster, is said to protect the user from being wounded. And, I mean, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. And Arthur really shouldn't have expected to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at him. You know, if anyone else had claimed themselves to be emperor, just because some moistened bint threw a scimitar at them, they'd probably get locked away. But legend has it that King Arthur will rise again and return when Albion or Britain's need is greatest. But until that day, all we can do is wait. Crystal skulls. So these are a type of artifact that date apparently all the way back to the Mesoamerica era, and these are normally in the Aztec or Mayan civilizations before the arrival of Columbus. And they are these ancient, mystical, apparently magical artifacts resembling human skulls. And while these ancient civilizations do have a lot of things depicting skulls, you know, they decorate things with skulls, they're kind of comfortable with skulls, there's not a ton of evidence to show that they ever really used or made crystal skulls. And so a lot of these are thought, at least in the modern day, to be 1800s productions, crafted somewhere in Europe to be sold as these ancient mystical artifacts. But others believe that they are actually alien artifacts, or alien skulls, or gifts from aliens perhaps. You know, maybe the aliens took this human skull, shot a laser at it, transformed it into glass or crystal, and then gave it back to the humans as a little gift. How nice of them. And maybe these skulls still have powers. Maybe they just originally had powers and it's kind of seeped out of them, so it's just a boring crystal skull now. And another theory was that the crystal skulls that we currently have are just 1800s replicas, but they were inspired by genuine crystal skulls that are seemingly no longer around. So there were these ancient magical crystal skulls. In the 1800s, they either heard of them or they saw them, they reproduced these copies, and now there's just so many of these copies everywhere, and the original magical crystal skulls have either been destroyed or lost or buried somewhere underground. And yeah, so there are a lot of theories for this one, and I think even if they're not real, they do look pretty cool. Tier 2, Holy Lance. So the Holy Lance, also known as the Spear of Longinus, was the spear that was apparently stabbed into the side of Jesus as he was being crucified. And the name Longinus was apparently the name of the Roman soldier who had the spear. And it doesn't actually come from the Bible, but it comes from the Gospel of Nicodemus, who named this soldier as Longinus. And while it is in theory a holy relic, I think it exists probably more in the minds of people, because if you think to back then, and this is just assuming that, Jesus existed and he died on the cross and all that. But if you're a Roman or a Roman soldier, there wasn't really much importance to Jesus at the time. So if this stabbing did happen, they probably stabbed him in the side, and then this was just, a random spear. Either they went on using it, or they destroyed it, or recycled it, or something. Like, the significance of Jesus really came quite a while after his death. So sadly, I think if this event did occur, the spear is most likely lost to time. It was never stored or saved. But that hasn't stopped, multiple holy lances apparently appearing. People say they have either fragments of the lance or the entire lance itself. But as I said, I do kind of doubt these claims. So the true cross, as you might imagine, refers to the actual cross that Jesus was crucified on. And this legend said that in the years roughly around 300, Saint Helena, who was the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, she traveled to Jerusalem, and there, while she was looking around, while she was exploring, she found 3 crosses. One was the cross of Jesus, and the other 2 were the 2 people that he was apparently crucified with, Dismas and Justus. But on the back of one of the crosses was carved the name of Jesus, and so she knew that this was Jesus's cross. At first she kind of doubted it apparently, but then these miracles started to happen with the cross, and that convinced her that this truly was the cross of Jesus. And there have been some interesting theories about this cross over the years. One of them being that the cross that Jesus was crucified on was made out of wood that originally came from the tree in the Garden of Eden. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one famously that caused Adam and Eve to be banished from the garden. And as with a bunch of the other artifacts, there are a ton of people, a ton of claims to having the real true cross. And these are mainly fragments, although their claims are, a little tentative. They're quite hard to verify. And the results for any tests done on them do come back a bit questionable, but it would be pretty cool to know where the cross was today, if in fact it was ever kept whole. Jesus's crucifixion nails is, you guessed it, another relic from Jesus's life or death, and this were the nails that were used to crucify him on the cross. And there are some differing beliefs on this, on whether there were 3 nails used to crucify him or 4, with those believing that there were 3 nails used being called triclavianists, which I'm not even joking, that is a classification of belief. And it was apparently Saint Helena, once again, who found these nails. She found the cross, she found the nails as well, she took them back to Constantinople. One of the nails was apparently used to make a bridle. One of them was used to make the helmet of Constantine, and the other 1 or 2 nails remaining, we don't really know what happened to them. But both the bridle and the helmet of Constantine are also lost, so no matter which way you swing it, all of the nails are currently missing. But there are, as always, if you look, many people claiming to have the actual nails, but there's only like 4 nails in history, and like 30 different claims to having the true nail, so they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. Moses's staff is, of course, the staff that Moses used in the story of Exodus to perform certain miracles or acts of God, such as getting water from a rock, parting the Red Sea, triggering all of the plagues of Egypt. And according to legend, the staff was created on the 6th day of creation and was passed down from man to man, from father to son, until it finally came to Moses. And similar to another legend we covered, this staff was apparently stuck in the ground, and this was in Moses' father-in-law's garden, and it was said that whoever could pull this staff out of the ground would be destined to lead Israel out of Egypt. And then we don't really know what happened to it. There are some claims to the staff, such as the one being held and displayed in the Topkapi Palace Museum, and this is in Istanbul, although there are a few other claims in a few different countries, such as the treasury of Sainte-Chapelle, and the idea was that it was moved from Jerusalem up to Constantinople, and then into France, and then it was held at this chapel. And just looking through all of these artifacts, I want to bring up a point that I brought up earlier about the original artifacts were most likely these boring kind of mundane items, like Longinus's spear. It was just a Roman spear. The Holy Grail was likely just a plain cup. You know, apart from stuff maybe like the Ark of the Covenant, which was covered in gold. Like a lot of the things that were irrelevant in the time that they were, you know, generated or made were, I think, very, very likely just lost to time. I mean, unless the Holy Grail is being used in a coffee shop in Ireland or something. I mean, what do I know? I just make videos on the internet. The Fountain of Youth. So this one isn't necessarily one artifact or place, but rather it's like a concept. And so many civilizations over the years have had concepts like this in some form or another, from Herodotus some 2,500 years ago in Greece, all the way up to the 16th century Caribbean myth of Bimini, and likely countless legends and myths in between those two, probably countless even before that, before written history, and likely a ton since then. And these myths and legends obviously all kind of vary from being a fountain, but they normally include water in some form, so whether that's a magical river or lake or spring, and all of the myths seemingly range in abilities as well, but they all normally do some form of healing, so whether that's healing wounds, whether that's reversing ages or healing diseases, or bringing things back to life, or in a few more quirky cases that I found, dressing people up in fancy clothes who are, you know, dipped in the lake, which pretty nice. And it also appears in the Bible with the idea of Jesus healing someone using this blessed water from the pool of Bethesda, in which an angel had apparently come down, stirred the water, and in stirring the water it put a blessing on the water that the next person to step into it would be cured of anything that afflicted them. The Trojan horse. So you probably all know of the Trojan horse, but the details of its legend and history are really quite interesting. The story goes that after a long 10-year siege on the city of Troy, the Greeks eventually gave up and said, fine, whatever, you win, city of Troy. We're just gonna go sail away now. Bye. And so they burnt all of their camps and tents. They built this giant horse as a tribute to the god Athena. And this horse was apparently to bless them for a safe journey home. And then they all got into their boats and sailed away. And when the Greeks were gone, the Trojans kind of peeked around, opened up the gates, saw this horse and blessing that they had left, and wanted to basically remove it, take the blessing for themselves, maybe increase the chances of the Greeks having a bad journey home. And they took this giant horse into their city, closed the gates again, and then come nightfall, secretly, the horse was actually filled with a bunch of some of the best Greek soldiers, and they snuck out of the horse, snuck round, opened the gates, and the rest of the Greek army didn't actually sail back. You know, earlier they got into their boats, they made it look like they were sailing away, and then when it hit night, they turned around, came back, and now the gates of Troy were open. So, needless to say, the Greeks went into the city of Troy, you know, killed all the people, destroyed it, and apparently one of the reasons that they made the horse so big, that the Greeks wanted to give this impression that the horse and the blessing was so big, it was too big to move, you know, basically making a statement, this is our blessing, we're gonna make it so big that you have zero chance of moving it, so you had better not take this into your city when we leave. And then the Trojans were like, you know what, we are going to take it into our city. And that was part of the story. Or so the legend goes. There have also been some historical accounts to suggest that this horse wasn't really a horse. You know, it wasn't a giant horse wooden figure, but rather it was a large ship. And the evidence for this is that the language used to describe the men getting into the horse is often the same language that's used to describe men boarding boats. So they thought this could have been a boat instead. And boats are pretty big, and they're made out of wood, and they were sometimes called seahorses in the day. And also they used to embellish the front of ships with, you know, images or animals, and sometimes that animal was a giant horse head on the front. So that's one of the theories. They left behind a giant wooden ship that kind of got mistranslated over the years and became a giant wooden horse. Or some theories say that this wasn't a giant wooden horse, but it was actually a giant wooden siege engine, because back in the day, siege engines were pretty great, except they had one weakness, and that was that they were made out of wood. So they were quite susceptible to flames, to flaming arrows, and so often they used to use this dampened horsehide to, buffer, to cover the siege engine in it. And so the idea of it being a giant wooden horse, horsehide, perhaps they had used this giant wooden horse to gain entry into the city, either, once again, by just smashing and destroying the walls, or by doing that same sailing away trick, leaving it there. And Troy thought, alright, let's collect everything they left behind. Oh look, a cool looking siege engine. I'll just take this over into the city, and then bam, tricked. Bamboozled. Or another theory, and we're kind of running out of theories here, but another theory says that this horse was actually an earthquake that destroyed Troy. So, an earthquake happened, it destroyed the walls of Troy, thus allowing the Greeks to enter. And this is partly due to Poseidon being the god of sea, so, the Greeks sailing away, and the god of horses, so the Trojan horse, and also the god of earthquakes. So again, this might have been a translation sort of thing, where an earthquake caused it, so then people started to say that Poseidon caused it, and then other people were like, hey, Poseidon, isn't that the god of horses? So you're saying a horse caused the collapse of Troy? And then, a rumor here, a whisper there, and the story all kind of gets mixed up. And there was archaeological evidence to show that the city of Troy had at some point been heavily damaged by an earthquake. So this theory isn't necessarily as terrible or crazy as it sounds. But if the horse ever did exist, where is it today? It's very, very, very hard to say. If you want my honest opinion, it probably got dismantled for lumber, as most boats and stuff tended to do in those days. You can't just leave good wood to go to waste. But that is the story of the Trojan horse. In tier 3, we have the crown of thorns. So according to the biblical account, this was a crown made out of thorns and placed on Jesus' head as he was being crucified. And this was both to mock him and to inflict pain on him, with the idea being the Romans like, oh yeah, you say you're king? You say you're the Lord? Alright, well, here's a crown we made for you. Hope you like wearing it, sort of thing. And there are some accounts of a thorn of crowns being kept and venerated in the, first few hundred years after Jesus' death. And according to these accounts, it was likely kept in the city of Jerusalem by some of his followers. It was then purportedly moved to the city of Constantinople after a few more hundred years. And then it stayed there for a few hundred years before being offered by the Emperor of Constantinople to King Louis IX of France in 1238. And this was seemingly the gift of like a dying empire. And while in France, it was kept in the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this was its longest stretch of time, from around the 1200s all the way up to 2019, when Notre Dame went up in flames and the crown ended up actually surviving, and it was moved for safekeeping, and then it was eventually replaced back into Notre Dame. And it was actually moved back there in December 2024, so like a few weeks ago, which is pretty cool. But this is the most convincing account and trace of an actual crown of thorns that we have. And interestingly enough, multiple thorns have actually been taken out of this crown of thorns over the years, and they have been gifted to various countries, especially in Europe, and there's even a thorn over in the United States of America. So a pretty cool one. I like that there's a decent paper trail for this one, and the gifting of these thorns represents kind of like a peace offering sort of thing. So I do like the idea of spreading out the love. The Veil of Veronica. So this is an ancient relic, this piece of cloth that was apparently given to Jesus as he was walking along, as he was bearing his cross, and it was used to wipe the sweat off Jesus's brow. And when it was returned to her, apparently it bore the face of Jesus. And there are records of this cloth being kept in the church, being safeguarded for at least 1,000 years. And while there are various other claims to this artifact, like one in Vienna, one in Alicante, one in Jaén, this one is the most widely known, the best believed one, and is held in the Vatican and brought out once a year for people to look upon. And a quick note about this cloth is said to heal illnesses, to cure blindness, to bring people back from the dead, as well as many more miracles, which begs the question, why in the flying fuggle is this cloth not being brought out and shown around the world every single day? You know, within a few months, we would completely cure blindness, cure every single disease, and I don't really have a good answer for that. Confederate gold is an entry we covered in one of the bloody icebergs. There's so many now. Mystery iceberg, alternate history iceberg. It was probably one of those. But this refers to the huge amount of gold and treasuries that went missing after the Civil War. And it all started with the soon-to-be evacuated New Orleans. And with the North approaching, the authorities advised everyone to just take all of your gold. And this was wealthy people, banks, insurance companies. They said, if you keep it here, the North is going to come, they're going to confiscate everything, so it's your best bet to move it out of the city. So most of them did. They took all of their gold, their silver, which was hundreds of millions of dollars worth in today's money, and they sent it via General Beauregard to the Georgian Iron Bank, where he assured it would be kept safe. Then, shortly afterwards, Beauregard received an email. Beauregard received a telegram telling him to go into the bank where he had just deposited all of this stuff and to withdraw all of this gold and silver. And when the president of the Iron Bank refused to give it to him because he said it wasn't his, it belonged to the people of New Orleans, Beauregard was instructed to just take it by force. And then the Secretary of War, General Randolph, instructed him to deliver it to the government depository in Georgia. And in Beauregard's own words, what became of that coin is, we believe, even to this day, a mystery. It was doubtless spent for the benefit of the Confederacy, but how and to what purpose, not having been regularly appointed by the Congress, has never been known to the South, especially to the stockholders and depositors of the Bank of Louisiana. So, was it used for the Confederacy in some manner, or was it stolen by either the Confederacy or by the North? Was it buried somewhere, or hidden, or forgotten about? And this is hundreds of millions of dollars, I might remind you. But as Beauregard said, we really have no idea what happened to it. The Ark of Noah was, as you all likely know, the ark or giant ship that Noah built to protect his family, to protect a bunch of animals from the worldwide flood that God apparently caused on the earth. And if you think this was just like a regular sized boat, no. People have calculated that given the estimated measurements for this, it could have housed roughly 2.15 million sheep, or sheep-sized animals, and the measurements for the ark were quite religiously significant, with the heights of each deck representing Israeli temples, and the compartments representing heaven, earth, hell, or, the underworld essentially. And partly because of the large amount of flood stories that we see in other cultures, in other civilizations, a few of which actually outdate the Old Testament, like for example Gilgamesh. It is commonly believed among archaeologists that this didn't actually happen, but it was more like a metaphor, a story, an allegory for God and his power and his will, etc. But also for his mercy, telling Noah, allowing Noah to build the ship, saving Noah and his family and a bunch of animals, and also with the ship representing the Israelis and their faith in God, because the ark was built with no steering wheel, so it was just floating around in the water, basically being steered by God's will. And so again, with this one, we're not entirely sure it even existed in the first place, but a lot of people do believe it did exist, and it is maybe buried somewhere, but we just don't know where. The Roswell debris. So I don't know why this is in the legendary artifacts iceberg, probably because it's one of the most well-known major alien UFO encounters. And if you do like alien encounters, I have one hell of a video for you here. It's over 8 hours of alien encounters, UFOs, theories. Mwah. Perfect. But the Roswell incident happened in 1947 when this thing, disc, object, whatever, was seen flying around the sky. And then later, it apparently crashed in a nearby farm. And the owner of this farmland reported this to the local police. They then reported it to the Roswell Army Air Force, or the RAAF. And they came along, they collected the debris, and they issued a press release saying that they had recovered a flying disc from this site, which obviously made massive headlines at the time. And so very shortly after, the army came out and issued another press release saying that this wasn't a flying disc that they recovered. It was instead a fallen weather balloon. And at the time, it seemed like everyone was kind of okay with that. For the most part, they were like, oh, okay, it's a weather balloon, crashed, whatever. But then, 30 years later, this man, Major Jesse Marcel, came out and said, look, this entire thing, it was one big cover-up. We hoaxed the whole thing. He said that it was a flying saucer that we went out there to recover, and every worker out there knew that this was the case, but they were told, act as if it's a weather balloon. Even these photos with Marcelin were apparently staged. They got this weather balloon material, they made it look like it was debris, but the actual flying disc that they recovered was never photographed, at least not publicly. And these are where the conspiracies basically come from, about them capturing this flying craft and taking it to a secret underground base, Area 51 or something. But as I said, if you're interested in this stuff, check out my Alien Iceberg. I cover God knows how many cases in that. And, while I've got you here, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. We're still a few short of the 1 million subscriber goal, I think, by the end of the day. Or do whatever you want to do. I'm not your dad. The robe of Jesus is, you may have guessed, a robe that Jesus was said to have worn shortly before his crucifixion. And what was special about this robe was, obviously, it was worn by Jesus, which made it special, but also it was a robe without seams. So after Jesus had died, the Romans took the robe and they were gonna cut it up by, the seams and divide it out. But because it didn't have seams, they decided not to separate it. And so that is, as the legend says, partly why it remains in one piece to this day. It was discovered by none other than Saint Helena, who, as you might remember, also discovered the Holy Cross and the Holy Nails. And so according to the legend, Helena discovered it in the year 300, and there wasn't really much record of it up until the 1100s, when it was written about in Trier, Germany. And it's a bit of a strange piece. It's had multiple modifications made to it over the years, with bits of taffeta and silk being sewed into it, likely in an attempt to, keep it whole, to repair any damages to it. And it was also dipped in some sort of rubber substance in the 1800s, again likely in a misguided attempt to kind of preserve it. But this dipping in rubber has likely removed any chance of scientists, properly aging the item. And originally this robe wasn't shown to anyone. It was taken, it was folded up neatly, it was kept in secret in this cathedral. But in the 1500s, Emperor Maximilian basically came to this cathedral. He demanded to be shown this robe, and so they took it out and they showed him. But then all of the locals were like, hey, why did he get to see it? We want to see the robe as well. And so the cathedral arranged like a yearly viewing of this, which wasn't always kept to. It was changed eventually to a 7-yearly viewing, and then it was changed to just whenever the cathedral decided to, I guess. And there is rumored to be a viewing in 2033, celebrating the 2000th anniversary of Jesus' death, which that sounds a bit weird, celebrating a death, but the date could possibly change, and it is still just a rumor. So if you want to go and see this robe, definitely keep an eye out for their updates. The Buddha's relics. So according to the scripture, the Buddha ordered his followers to, after his death, cremate him, and to take all of his remains, all of his ashes, and all of his belongings, and all of his scriptures, and distribute them into these tiny little buildings or shrines called stupas. So over time, they apparently did this. They took his ashes, his bones, his teeth, his skull fragments, as well as his belongings, his robe, his bowl, his staff, and supposedly a king, King Ashoka, was able to divide all of these things and distribute them into over 84,000 stupas and shrines, with these stupas basically representing Buddha's presence. And an interesting part about this was that the Buddha was said to experience 3 deaths in relation to him and his being. So one, nirvana, was when he reached enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, which was the death of all of his potential future rebirths. One was when he actually physically died, which was obviously the death of his mind and body. And another will apparently occur where all of Buddha's remains, all of his knowledge, all of his quotes, his teachings, all of that is destroyed. And when no living being remembers Buddha, speaks about Buddha, knows the name, just when he is forgotten completely among the entire universe, then and only then will this third nirvana occur, where all of his relics will, revive. The Buddha himself will kind of come back to life. His body will be restored. He will fly back to the exact spot he reached this first nirvana, under the Bodhi tree, and he will sit there in the lotus position and once more emit these beams of light that illuminate 10,000 worlds. He will be worshipped one last time by the gods, and then finally burst into flames and disappear for all eternity. At least that's what the legends say. Tier 4, Abraham's Pot. So this is one of the many artifacts being displayed and stored in the Topkapi Palace Temple in Istanbul, Turkey. And some of the others are the Sword of Muhammad, the Mantle of Muhammad, and his banner and his footprints, and Joseph's turban, the Sword of David, the Staff of Moses, and many more. And this, Abraham's Pot, is said to be the pot that Abraham used as kind of a cooking pot, and that's basically all we have on it. It should be noted that a lot of these artifacts, the Sword of David, Joseph's turban, some of these are incredibly old. They're super hard to verify. The chances of them being passed down safely over the years and not being swapped out, not being hoaxed, not being anything like that is, I think, incredibly low. So believe these if you will, but yeah, Abraham's Pot is just one of the many artifacts, apparent artifacts, kept here. Zulfikar is the sword of Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, which uniquely has this kind of split at the end of it. And the origin and meaning of this name has been kind of debated over the years. Zulfikar, it could be a reference to maybe the Orion belt, alluding to maybe the divine nature of this sword. It could also be derived from the words meaning spine splitter, which is quite brutal of a name, but it would probably fit. Or to it being kind of a metaphorical splitter. So this sword, splitting truth from lies, splitting good from evil, and with the wielder, Ali Talib, being able to differentiate these. A bunch of Middle Eastern and Islamic swords have over the years been kind of fashioned like this, I guess in reference to the Zulfikar, and the imagery appears in decorations, in actual swords as I said, also in paintings, in flags. And as to the actual location of the sword, we don't really know. It's never turned up after some of the initial references to it. It was very likely probably buried, lost, destroyed, and although it may turn up somewhere, perhaps buried in a tomb or something, it hasn't yet to this day, and so we don't really know where it is, or if it still even exists. Palladium. So this was a wildly fascinating artifact whose history dates back all the way to the goddess of Athena, who killed her friend Pallas accidentally, or Pallas, while having a friendly competition with him, and because she felt so guilty about this, she decided to make a statue of herself, which yeah, that's absolutely the correct thing to do. And then this statue then fell from the heavens, landed in the city of Troy, or the land that Troy was built in. And then this statue became a symbol of safety for the city, with it being believed that as long as the statue stayed within the city walls, that the city would forever be safe. And wouldn't you know it, during the Trojan horse incident, the one we covered earlier, the Greeks actually do manage to get into the city, they get into the temple, and they take this palladium out of the city, which it is said accelerated the downfall of Troy. Then Aeneas, the legendary defender of Troy, he was able to sneak out, avoid the total destruction of Troy, and take the palladium along with a bunch of other escaped Trojans with him, and go on a crazy journey across the Mediterranean, visiting kings and powerful people and leaders, and fighting battles until eventually they came to Italy, where eventually they settled down, they placed the palladium, and then his descendants would eventually found this small, tiny little city that you may have heard of before, that being the city of Rome. And the statue was kept in Rome for likely hundreds of years, protecting the city just as it did protect Troy. And we think that it might have been transferred over to Constantinople, when Constantine moved the Roman capital over there, and then from there he may have buried it somewhere in the city, either under an important building to help with the blessing, or under just some random area in order to keep it safe and keep it more secret. But the evidence for this is all really a bit sketchy, and we really have kind of no idea where it is today. Chinese treasure ships. So for this entry, we need to introduce a man named Admiral Zheng He, and sorry for the pronunciation on that, but he was an admiral, obviously, in the Chinese Ming dynasty of the 1400s. And during this time, he launched several huge naval expeditions, and this was over around 30 years, and the size of these expeditions was just just insane. The ships themselves were often well over 100 meters or 400 feet in length. Some of them contained 3,600 men per ship, and in the first expedition alone, there were 63 ships, meaning roughly 30,000 men. And then the second expedition was roughly 250 ships, so again, likely around 100,000 men on this expedition. And there were 7 voyages in total, and the aim of these was basically to kind of spread the word about China. And it wasn't necessarily to like invade people, but it was more to, you know, go around to trade all of our goods, to buy goods from other places, to put out the word like, yo, China is super powerful. Look at this huge navy we have. You know, do you have this many huge ships? Can you do these huge expeditions? Yeah, didn't think so. So they went around, they made statues, they set up trade agreements, trade deals, they set up routes for themselves, and it was honestly pretty successful. The expeditions soon stopped due to these kind of internal affairs, internal wars in China, and we don't to this day know where any of these ships went. They were likely probably recycled in some form, and the treasure shipyard in Nanjing, where most of these boats were probably built, did eventually just kind of fall into disuse, fall into disrepair. It was kind of forgotten about before eventually being demolished. And there have been shipwrecks of a few of these Chinese ships found like at the bottom of the ocean with all of these goods from all around the world, but these only likely represent just a few of the ships. And I think most of them were probably taken back to China, dismantled, used for other things, changed into, you know, other ships. And it is kind of sad to see them kind of destroyed in this way, but the story of these expeditions was absolutely epic. The Cloak of Muhammad was an artifact that apparently Muhammad wore on his journey from Mecca to Jerusalem in 621 AD. So the legend says after his journey, Muhammad gave his cloak to his friend Hazrat, and he passed it down through generations and generations through his family until it was eventually given to Amar Shah Durrani in 1768. And he is often considered the founder, more or less, of Afghanistan, or at least modern Afghanistan. And they have kept it in the Kirka Sharif shrine in Afghanistan, guarded by the same family for 250 years. And as with a bunch of these artifacts, it has these divine powers, such as healing, bringing good fortune, and warding off evil spirits. King Arthur's Round Table. So this originates from, as we explored before, the whole myth and legends surrounding King Arthur. And King Arthur's court was apparently filled with these famous and skilled warriors and knights. Like some many of you have probably heard of, King Lancelot, or Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Sir Galahad, etc. And the idea was to have this round table, which that's more like a teardrop shape, but you have this round table such that anyone sitting at the table is equally distant to the center of the table as anyone else. So obviously on a normal table, you probably have the head of a table, you know, the most important person, and you have everyone is like slightly further away from the table at different points. But the idea behind this was that everyone in his court was an equal. So he was no more important than any of his knights, and so he had a round table. And I mean, we're not entirely sure if King Arthur even actually existed, but if it did exist, this is one of the relics. We're not entirely sure where the round table is today. Might have been buried, might have been forgotten about, might have been destroyed, or it might in fact never have actually existed. Nantios Cup. Was this cup, I mean, it's not really being used as a cup anymore with all of these holes, but it was purportedly transported and kept safe. I mean, not too safe with the bloody state of it, but it was said to be a cup made from the wood of Jesus's actual cross. Or some thought that it was the Holy Grail, or some thought that it was both, and that's a bit far-fetched, I think, because how can you have this cup exist before Jesus' death, you know, for him to drink from at the Last Supper, and then for it also to be made of the cross that he was later crucified on? But it was moved around. It was eventually kept in Wales until the 1500s, and then it was snuck out of the abbey that it was kept in during the Catholic Reformation. And this is when churches basically up and down the country were being destroyed, were being looted, mostly under the orders of King Henry VIII. It was then moved to Nantios, also in Wales, where it remained for apparently almost 400 years, until it was publicly displayed by George Powell in 1870. 1978. So a pretty cool little wooden artifact. The Elixir of Life, also known as water. But no, this Elixir of Life was first mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an old story, some like 4,000 years ago, where Gilgamesh starts to kind of worry about his own mortality, and so he seeks out a man called Utnapishtim, who was basically this early inspiration for Noah, with Utnapishtim being instructed to build a giant ark, or a giant boat, to load all of his family onto, as well as a bunch of animals. And this was because one of the gods was flooding the entire earth because he was kind of sick of humans. And so this basically kills all of mankind except for Utnapishtim. The flood lasts for 6 days and 6 nights, and then that's basically the end of the flood. He gets out of the boat and is rewarded by the gods with immortality because of his faith and devotion. But anyway, Gilgamesh is afraid of death, so he seeks out Utnapishtim, who is still alive because he's now immortal, and he asks him about immortality, to which he instructs Gilgamesh to dive down to the bottom of the ocean and to retrieve this special plant. And so Gilgamesh goes into the ocean, dives all the way down. He finds this plant, but this bloody, slippery snake serpent of the sea takes it and consumes it before Gilgamesh can. And so Gilgamesh doesn't attain immortality, but rather the snake does. And this is apparently symbolic of how snakes shed their skin. So, you know, they die in one skin and then they're reborn into another skin, which snakes aren't really immortal, by the way. It's all just bloody snake propaganda. But this idea also appears in Chinese legends, in Indian legends, and Islamic, European, African, just basically all over the entire world. And it's often linked to magic, mysticism, alchemy, and gods or, you know, divine creatures. And this entry is actually a little different to the previous ones, in that we actually do know exactly where this is located. And that is right here in this glass. Immortality. And I will be giving a single drop of this Elixir of Life to everyone who subscribes. So, 1 subscribe for 1 life of eternity. Pretty even trade, I would say. Or don't, but don't say I didn't offer. In tier 5, we have the Holy Prepuce. The Holy Prepuce is Jesus's circumcised bits. 2,000-year-old skin from down there. Lovely. But the first records of this claim come from the 800s, when this was presented to Pope Leo III, allegedly being a gift delivered by an angel. And throughout the years, as with many other artifacts, other people, other places, churches, countries, etc., have claimed to have either the original one or little bits of it, little pieces, with as many as 18 different places claiming to have pieces of this, which it's like, how do you even break something this small up into 18 pieces? I'm just like, how? But in 1983, the Holy Prepuce was stolen, and I don't know why someone would, but it was never recovered, and so we don't know where it is to this day. The Brazen Head. So this is kind of a cool thing of legends. It's this kind of automaton AI thing, and it's like a living thing, but also not really. Kind of maybe like a robot or a golem. But this Brazen Head was something in legends that was built like a machine, or it was summoned or generated with magic or mysticism depending on the legend, or by using some sort of science like perhaps a Frankenstein sort of tale, or Frankenstein's monster, or in some legends kind of a bit of both. It was often written as being made of either bronze or brass, and it would reply to any questions you asked it, but would only be able to respond with either a yes or no answer. The legends go back as far as the 12th century, and continue, especially among alchemists, to this current day, but no physical or serious account or evidence for them has ever been found. But I would love to see them exist. They sound so cool. The Seer Stones are these mystical divine stones that have apparently been used by seers and magicians and mystic type people over the years. But I think the most notable, maybe the most famous example of a seer stone would be by the founder of the Latter-day Saints during the translation of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith. So he apparently discovered his first seer stone in New York in 1822, and this is while he was digging a well He found the stone, and he apparently used it to translate some text. And what he would do is he would take his seer stone, he would put it into a hat, he would kind of cover up all the light, he would look into the hat, and from the seer stone he would see these, visions or revelations or like information that he could learn, and with that he was able to dictate or transcribe the Book of Mormon. There were a few different stones that he personally used, but by far his most famous one, his favorite one, was this brown one that he found in the well, and it is kept under the protection of the LDS Church and has been since the times of Joseph Smith. The many other stones he had and used, however, are seemingly completely lost, or we just don't know where they are. Alkahest/Azoth. So Azoth is kind of a combination or a mix of like the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life. Its name derives from the Arabic for the word mercury, being al-zabak, and originally described this hypothetical liquid that could, transform mercury into gold or silver, but it kind of transformed and evolved over the years, the myth of this thing, and over the years it seemingly got more and more abilities, more and more properties, until it could, cure all illnesses, extend life, even, bring people back from the dead. And it could even enlighten people, raise them up to a higher level, a higher plane of understanding or enlightenment, kind of like Victor from Arcane. And no one has really properly claimed or discovered this yet. Over the years there were some accounts of this kind of existing, but they're often thought to just be representations of it or stories, and there's no one really that claims in the modern day to have possession of this. But that doesn't mean that it can't exist. Hihirokane is this crazy mythical metal in Japanese legends that's supposedly red, flame-colored, is lighter than gold, and yet stronger than diamonds. It is considered extremely rare, extremely valuable. It can boil water just by sitting in it, and it has been used in a few fantasy settings over the years, like for example Scarletite in Final Fantasy, which is pretty cool. It was apparently more common in, days of old, and was used to build all these mythical weapons and tools and armors, but has been slowly losing its power, or just the volume of these metals gets lost over time, so it became a thing of legends. And the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, for example, were said to be made from this metal, which, those treasures in and of themselves should be on this list because they're mysterious as all get out. But as well as those other properties, this metal apparently can't rust, and it is a great conductor of both heat and emotions, souls, and the metal itself is said to be the last remnants of this great worldwide Japanese empire from billions of years ago, and that's a pretty long time ago. That's like before the dinosaurs. But there's no further evidence for this one. We're not sure if it ever did exist, and we're even less sure of a billion-year-old Japanese worldwide empire. But if you do find any, then drop me a little message down below, as I would love to smelt it down and make a mug out of it. Toadstones were these cool little stones that were found and revered for seemingly thousands of years, with one of the first ever mentions of these stones dating back to the year 77. And that's not 1977, literally the year 77, which is a long time ago. But these stones were smooth, they were kind of perfect, and they were used in both jewelry as well as practical purposes because they were said to hold mystical abilities and properties. They were said to cure illnesses, treat diseases, and just all round spread good vibes. And they were called toadstones because they were said or rumored to grow inside the heads of toads, which is probably not true. They were or are likely these fossilized fish teeth from the Shinsteer, this thing, which is kind of part cool, part creepy, part beautiful, part disturbing. But yeah, do they treat poison? Probably not. I wouldn't recommend it. Just go to a doctor or something. But do they look cool? Absolutely. Templar treasures. So this is a super interesting topic that involves the Knights Templar from the 12th century, and one of the first interesting things I learnt about them quite a while back was that only around 10% of the order were actually knights. I know, it's like knight is literally in their name, but 90% of the Knights Templar aren't actually knights. The rest were like middle management, or they were in religious roles or financial roles, because as well as being a huge fighting force, force, they were also incredibly wealthy. They set up things like banks, they put out loans, they managed debts, and they traded in money, they traded in products, so stuff like merchanting, and in building things, in construction projects. They were pretty huge. And when knights signed up to this order, they had to transfer all of their money and possessions over to the order, and then swear a vow of poverty, chastity, piety, and obedience to the order, and to conquer the Holy Lands. And in exchange for all of that, they were promised bread, water, and the poor clothing of the house, and also much pain and suffering, which, yeah, sign me up. Sounds like a fantastic deal. And a bunch of the places that either the Knights Templar used or that they built are still to this day called something to do with Templar, temple, that sort of thing. Like, for example, the Temple Bar in London, or the Temple Church or Station, also in London, as well as many, many more of these throughout Europe. But the order was very powerful, as I said, very rich, getting richer and richer by the year, and eventually they grew too big for their own boots, and the order was shut down and subsequently persecuted. And as they were being persecuted, they basically split off. Bunch of them fled. They took almost all of their treasures, their gold, their valuables, and we don't really know what they did with a lot of it. There are rumors that say it was either confiscated secretly by the church, or, the rulers of that time, or people say that the Templars, buried it somewhere in Europe, or that they took it and went up to Scotland, because they had quite a few good, rich friends up in Scotland who were probably willing to protect them. And then from there, they either buried it in Scotland, or even sailed over to the New World, because Scotland had some connection with the Vikings, and the Vikings were known for having traveled actually over to America. So with Scottish protection, with the maps and ships and abilities of the Vikings, this is one of the big theories that they took all of the treasure, all of the gold, took it on these ships over to America, over to the New World, and then buried it over there, eventually assimilating into the local people and basically forgetting where they put it, which has led to theories like the buried treasure in Oak Island, which we covered in the Unsolved Mystery Iceberg. So a fascinating mystery. We have basically no idea where their treasures are, where they were put, where they were buried or kept or anything like that. And the topic of the Templars goes super, super deep if you want to read into it, which I highly recommend that you do. Joan of Arc's sword. So this is a fascinating little piece of history regarding, well, Joan of Arc's sword. And she apparently found this sword by, listening to these voices, by following these vibes, and it led her behind an altar at the Saint Catherine de Fierbois. And in the ground, buried, covered in rust, was this sword. So she dug it up, she removed the rust, and apart from the sword bearing these 5 crosses designed on the blade, we don't know how long it was, how wide it was, the weight of it, or really any of the other design details. And apparently it wasn't too unusual to find buried swords, because a lot of warriors did bury their swords for whatever reason, either to retire the sword or for some sort of blessing, which also brings up kind of an additional mystery in this as to who the sword originally actually belonged to. Some say it belonged to Charlemagne's father, Charles Martel, who fought off the Muslim invasion in Europe in the Middle Ages, and so the legend says that Charles buried his sword and that it would be dug up by the next person destined to defend France. And that, apparently, according to the legends, was Joan of Arc. And she herself is a fascinating figure, but we'll perhaps get into that another time. And she never really used this sword as a sword in a way. Being Puppycat, used the sword as a sword. But it was old, clearly, it had been rusted, it was most likely blunt, and so she never used it in battle or to kill anyone, but she did use it kind of as a symbol of power, and also to, chase people away, to bonk them on the heads. But before she was killed, she refused to say where she buried it, or where she had hidden it, or where she had kept it, and still to this day, it has not been found. The Hand of Glory was this old tradition, I guess, of cutting off the left hand of someone who was hanged for murder and pickling the hand drying it out, and then this resulted in the Hand of Glory. Gross. But then they went one step further, and they extracted the fat from this hanged person and turned it into wax, into a candle. And apparently, if you made a candle out of it and then slotted it into the Hand of Glory, some very interesting things would happen. Whenever you lit the candle, it would freeze the person in front of it, which they're probably just freezing because they're terrified of how much of a psycho you are. Or you could also upgrade this by taking some hairs from the hanged person and using them in the candle as a wick. And then this upgraded Hand of Glory would illuminate everything, but only for the holder. So you could walk around at nighttime, you could see everything with this candle, but no one else could see the light, giving you some sort of pseudo-invisibility, or so the legends say. It was also able to unlock any doors that you presented the hand to, which is a very handy, pun intended, ability to have. But we're not really hanging people anymore these days. It's kind of out of fashion, so the amount of these Hands of Glories is kind of slowly going down over the years. But yeah, let me know below what you think about this one. Tier 6, Drake's Drum. So this is a drum that Sir Francis Drake had with him, during his expeditions traveling around the world. And in the 1500s, on his last expedition, on his deathbed, he apparently ordered that this drum be immediately shipped back and returned to England, and that if England was ever in need, that they should just play the drum and it would summon Sir Francis Drake, which sounds like an awesome plot for a film if it hasn't been done already. But the drum was taken back to Buckland Abbey, or Drake's family home, and has seemingly remained there ever since under protection, and I guess for security reasons, as it is so fragile. We don't know exactly where it is kept. We know it's probably kept somewhere here in England, in this area sort of thing, but it's all kept incredibly vague. There are a few replicas that have been made and displayed over the years, and apparently these are quite accurate, so you can kind of see what it looks like, or at least what it did look like. But as to the location of the actual drum, we don't really know, but it is probably in safe hands. And according to legend, it was said to have been heard in multiple places at multiple times, and these times were kind of important to the English nation, such as the departure of the Mayflower in 1620, or Napoleon's arrival as prisoner, Plymouth Harbor, the start of World War I, the surrender of the German Navy, and also in a few major events in World War II. And if anyone does try to play this drum or beat it, it may just turn to dust. So I don't know how Sir Francis Drake expects us to summon him, but it is what it is. Lingurium. So this was this mythical gemstone that was often listed in medieval texts. These ancient European bestiaries. And yes, they're called bestiaries, not bestiaries for some reason, but these were these huge encyclopedias, often illustrated. They had lists of beasts of gems, of rocks, and with all this detail about each one, and they must honestly at the time have been pretty cool. But this gem was said to be made from the solidified urine of lynxes, which is pretty gross. And these gems could apparently cure any ailments, could cure diseases. They could attract various types of metals, put one on a stick and try and locate the metal or something. And the best ones were made by wild lynxes and also by male lynxes, because of course they were. And in a lot of these entries, the lynxes were noted as hiding these gems from humans, hiding gems made from their own solidified urine just to spite the humans, I guess. They're like, no, we don't want you humans to have them. And so they swallowed them to keep the humans from benefiting from their powers. Pretty wild, but it is an interesting piece of ancient history. The Sudarium of Oviedo, or the Shroud of Oviedo, is this veil or cloth said to be wrapped around Jesus' head when he had died. It is currently stored in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Spain, in this kind of chest of sorts, and it is displayed 3 times every year. Once on Good Friday, once on September the 14th, and once on September the 21st, and is thought to be of the same origin as the Shroud of Turin, with both cloths apparently showing traces of the blood type AB, and both of them showing similar blood patterns. And the cloth was allegedly taken from the empty tomb by Jesus' followers, and kept somewhere. We don't really have any records of it. But the next mention of it is in the year 570 AD. So like 500 years later, when it was being kept in a cave nearby Jerusalem. And then from there, it was taken to Egypt. And then from Egypt along North Africa. And then across the Mediterranean over into Spain, where it resides to this day. The Sword of Victory, or the, and I'm gonna completely screw this up, but the Fra Sankanchaisi, I am terribly sorry, but this is a royal sword that represents the power and authority of the Thai royalty, and it is honestly a pretty beautiful sword. It is made out of iron, with the whole thing being packaged in these cool looking gems. You know, part of it's made from quartz, gold, sapphires, rubies, and it was discovered in 1957 in the crypt of Wat Aracha Borana. But as to its true original origins, where it actually came from, we don't really know. Some say it was found by a fisherman in the 1700s and then presented to King Rama I as a gift, but that doesn't explain where it came from either. Some say it dates all the way back to the Sukhothai Empire, which was in the 1100s and then was passed down generation to generation. And others say it was gifted by the divine, gifted by the gods, and that's where it originally came from, which further proves and emphasizes the royalty's right to rule, their divinity, their power, etc. It does have a few mystical properties, apparently, allegedly, and the story goes that when it was brought into the city of Bangkok, 7 lightning strikes hit the city, which apparently symbolized and signified this sword's immense power. As I said, it is a super beautiful sword, and it is kind of fascinating to think, to imagine, you know, where it actually came from, where it was made, who made it, when they made it, and yeah, these are all very good questions. The Cup of Jamshid. So this was this legendary Persian artifact believed to have these magical, mythical, divine properties, such as divination, you know, seeing into the future, seeing events that haven't happened yet, or psychic knowledge, or some form of scrying, so seeing places where you currently are not. Or this cup was said to contain something akin to, you know, the elixir of life. It would heal people, it would make people immortal, bring them back from the dead. And it was written about a ton in like the 10th century in Persian and Eastern poems, stories, manuscripts. So it goes quite far back. It's been talked about quite a bit, but we have no evidence to say whether it existed or not, and whether it exists to this day. The gold train of the bad guys from World War II. And once again, it's stupid that I have to censor that, but it is what it is. But this was a train purportedly filled with gold and jewelry and, you know, rare treasures and all sorts. And towards the end of World War II, when the Germans knew that they were kind of losing the war, they apparently moved this train secretly to this underground secret train bunker and moved it way deep underground, sealed everything off, collapsed the tunnels, and this was apparently in southwest Poland. And after the war, no one ever found it. It was said to contain a huge 300 tons worth of valuables, which is just insane. So obviously a bounty that big has, you know, attracted some attention, generated some legends. And the Polish army during the Cold War even did like these extensive searches for this train, but they never ended up finding it. And in 2015, 2 men claimed to have found this train. As they were using these underground radars, they apparently detected something that was kind of train shaped, and so the Polish military came in. They started this huge dig, but eventually found that these images on the radar were just kind of train-shaped rock formations. Very sad, I know. But this train, full of 300 tons worth of treasures, gold, might be buried somewhere out there and might still one day be found. The Gates of Alexander. So these were these great gates, these fortifications that Alexander the Great apparently built. And these were to keep out the barbarians from the north or from southern Siberia. And they were said to be the great dividing line between the civilized world and the barbaric world. And the evidence for this one is a little unclear. There were a few mentions of other passes over the years, you know, from the Derbent Pass to the Darial Pass to the Great Gorgon Wall, the Caspian Pass, etc. And while we do have references to these, they're often kind of conflated and confused with one another. And so we have a few, for example, that Alexander the Great is actually credited with building, but then we found out it was built 600 years after Alexander Alexander, so there is some confusion on this whole topic, but we still don't know exactly to what the Gates of Alexander is referring, or where it's located, or rather where it was located. But all mysteries aside, it was very likely just a great wall with some great fortifications. The story of Alexander the Great is just insane. There are a few really cool videos out there if you want to check out the whole story. But yeah, were the gates built and then later destroyed? Were they just confused with another wall or another gate? Were they perhaps buried somehow? We don't really know, but I will leave a link to a very cool video down in the description that basically covers the entire life and conquest and adventure, etc. of Alexander the Great. The Kurtana, or the Sword of Mercy, is a sword that's one of the British crown jewels and is used in the coronation of new kings and queens. Not that there's been too many of them recently, but that is partly what it's used for. It has a blunted blade and a squared tip to represent mercy, and my lord is it a gorgeous sword. And the history for the origin of this sword is a little debated. It first appeared in records from like the 1200s as Kurtana or Curtain, some variation of that, and this was during Henry III's wedding. And it can be seen here having more of a kind of jaggedy tip, which represented more, I guess, like the tip of a sword snapped off, rather than what it is today, like a cleanly cut end of the sword. And so it originally looked like this before it was squared off. Some legends say that it originally belonged to Sir Tristan, one of the Knights of the Round Table, because there was a receipt written by King John, or rather signed by King John, in the year 1207 for the storing of one Tristram's or Tristan's sword. And Tristan's sword in these legends was said to have a broken off tip, because when he was in battle with the giant Irish warrior Morholt, he apparently got his sword lodged into Morholt's skull, and then it broke off the tip. So there is a theory that this was actually Tristan's sword, broken tip and all, and it has been kept and passed down through the generations. Or there is a theory that says that this originally belonged to Edward the Confessor of England, and this was all the way back in the 11th century, and whose death kind of sparked the Norman-French invasion of England. But we don't really know officially where it came from, or who made it, or when, but it does remain a very cool, if not mysterious sword. Tier 7, the Emerald Tablet. So this text likely found in the 1st century by a man named Belinus, who was a Greek philosopher, and he said that he found this Emerald Tablet in this cave, and this was inside of a hidden chamber within the cave. And there was, according to the legend, this old man lying there, or rather this skeleton of an old man, because he was a skeleton, he wasn't a person, and skeletons are people, or at least they used to be people, and I've completely complicated this. But basically there was a skeleton lying there with something in its hand, and this something apparently was the Emerald Tablet. And according to the legend, he took this tablet, he translated it, he stored it, kept it, brought it out, moved it around, stored it again, until over the years of this constant moving, translating, storing, etc., it was basically lost and almost forgotten about. It is now kind of a thing of myth and legends. We don't have the original copy, and that is if it ever actually did exist itself. And there have been many translations and versions of this Emerald Tablet, with it mainly being a alchemical document, with its author often being believed to be Hermes Trismegistus, which was kind of a ancient mix or fusion between the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, as often Hermes was the god of speaking, of messages, of languages, etc. And the chamber that this tablet was, apparently according to legend, found in was under a temple dedicated to Hermes. So the idea is that maybe the skeleton was a devout person of Hermes, or a follower of him. Hermes wrote this tablet, gave it down to this person. Maybe they were alive when they received it, maybe they were already a skeleton, and it was intended to teach all of humans about alchemy and all about a bunch of cool other stuff. Sadly, as I said, no physical copy of this remains, and we don't know if it ever existed, we don't know what originally was written in it, and no one was ever able to use or utilize the information in it to, transform anything into gold, to create the Philosopher's Stone, for example. So we kind of squandered that gift from Hermes. The Sibylline books. So these were these books of prophecy, purchased by the last king of Rome, Lucius Malfoy. No, I'm only kidding. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. And I just love these old Roman names. But this was in around the year 500 BC. And as the story goes, he was approached by a Sibyl, which was like a female prophesizer sort of thing. You know, she saw the future, she saw prophecies, and she offered him 9 books of prophecies for a very high price. He then declined this trade. He said, you know, either I don't want them or it's too pricey. So she was like, alright, fine. She went away, burnt 3 of the books, and then returned to him, offering the remaining 6 books for the same very high price. He once again apparently said no, so she went away again, burnt 3 more, came back to him with the same offer. So the books at this point were 3 times as expensive, but I guess afraid that he was going to lose all of this knowledge, he ended up purchasing these 3 books, and these are the Sibylline books. But he did buy them and kept them in a secret vault below the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, and they were taken out every now and then to be read, to be interpreted, to be like kind of horoscopes or fortune cookies. And when they had a plague, when they were fighting a war, when they couldn't make a decision, they would, you know, sometimes go through these books and use their revelations in order to help guide them. And this was until the temple was more or less destroyed in 83 BC. So after that, more kinds of versions, copies of these were produced until they were later fully destroyed in the year 405, and this was by General Flavius Stilicho, and he ordered them destroyed because I think he thought that they were kind of threatening his authority. You know, maybe he told them to go do something and then they were like, oh yeah, okay, let us just check the books. And then he was just sick of these books, so he just destroyed them. And these books were written in the Greek hexameter verse, with some examples of this being Sing Goddess, The Anger of Achilles, Peleus' son, or Over the Sea, past Crete, on the Syrian shore to the southward. But although we know of the existence of these books, we don't actually have any idea what was in them, because they were known, but they were never like brought out for the public to see, or even had their contents copied or written down. Because if you think about it, if that ever got out into the public, or even worse, to, you know, enemy states, to enemy countries, if they knew some of your prophecies, if they knew your horoscopes, they could potentially predict what you might do in a certain scenario. And obviously this would be a bad thing. So yeah, we have no idea what was in these books, we have no idea what was written, and they were destroyed seemingly for all eternity. Kind of reminds me of the Library of Alexandria, and the loss of information makes me very sad. Hierot. So if you haven't heard of Beowulf, it was this epic poem, this story more or less, that was written around the year 700 in modern day England. But the story within the poem takes place long before this, in mainly Sweden, Denmark and Frisia, or this area of northern Germany / the Netherlands. And in this epic tale, the King of Danes is basically attacked and threatened by this great monster, Grendel, who comes in, attacks his people, attacks his settlements, destroys a bunch of stuff, and notably attacks the king's mead hall, Hierot. Then, spoilers, Beowulf kills Grendel and saves the day, but people have started to question the origin of the mead hall Hierot. So was it just completely made up? Was it made up but inspired by some other hall? Or was it actually based on a real hall that they knew about at the time? Now, we haven't uncovered where it was or even any archaeological evidence of the beer hall itself, or rather the mead hall, but one contender for potentially being an inspiration for this hall was the Hearty Hall on the Isle of Sheppey, which apparently was known as Hierot in its time, or it was one of the great halls in Denmark, specifically Lejre, which digs and searches around this area have shown evidence of these Viking halls that date back to like the year 600-700. But the hall itself was absolutely epic in the story, and it actually inspired J.R.R. Tolkien in, you know, his Lord of the Rings, and served as inspiration for the Golden Hall of King Theoden, as well as inspiring many other themes in many other stories, such as Vikings and Game of Thrones. Q Source, also sometimes called the Sayings Gospel, or just Q if you're really cool, but this was a hypothetical document that scholars believe was the source for some of the biblical writings, and it's fairly conventionally believed that the writings of Matthew and Luke were written after the Book of Mark, and they used the Book of Mark for some of their inspiration. But there are also a bunch of sayings from Jesus that appear in Matthew and Luke that don't appear in Mark. meaning that they likely used a second source, to draw some of these sayings from, but it can't have been Mark because these sayings weren't actually in Mark. And we have never been able to identify or locate this secondary source. Scholars think that perhaps the books of Matthew and Luke took enough of the contents of this source. They copied this source so well. All of the sayings were in Matthew and Luke, and people liked the way that these books interpreted the sayings. So people just started to use the books of Matthew and Luke as a source for these sayings. So people didn't really need the original source anymore. It kind of fell out of popularity. It stopped being copied. And all we have is Matthew and Luke. But what this original source was, where it came from, who wrote it, what exactly it contained, is the massive mystery here. It was apparently just Jesus's sayings, quotes from Jesus, parables, and they were divided into wisdom sayings and judgment sayings, and also some narrative ones. And some of the things believed to have come from this source are, for example, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and many, many other parables. Nehushtan was, and this is kind of funny because the name itself is most likely a pun, either on the Hebrew word for snake, or for brass, or for both. And it was this bronze serpent statue that Moses built with instruction from the Lord, and he placed it on a stick. Now, to add some context for this, the Israelites were basically turning away from God, turning away from Moses, and so God sent down these snakes to bite and kill them. And then they were all bitten, poisoned, they were dying, and they seemingly repented. They turned back towards Moses and God, and then God instructed Moses. He said, create this bronze snake statue, put it on a stick, hold it up for all the Israelites to see, and whosoever looks upon this statue will be cured. And so he did that. A bunch of the Israelites were cured, and the statue was actually kept until King Hezekiah later destroyed it, because he said the Israelites were now worshipping this statue and, giving offerings to it, saying prayers to it, and so worshipping anything other than God or Yahweh was clearly a big no-no. But the idea of a snake on a staff, wrapped around stuff, and especially one that is kind of healthy, cures ailments or injuries or diseases, is a very old concept, with origins even older than the Bible, with one of the Mesopotamian gods, Ningish-Zida, using a staff with two snakes coiled around it. And this was potentially as far back as 4000 BC, so like 6000 years ago, and we still use this symbol today in hospitals, A&E places, doctors, etc. So a super ancient concept. It goes back at least 6,000 years. Very likely it goes back in the oral tradition to 10,000, 15,000 or more years ago. And it was in the Bible, and we still use it today. So yeah, some great continuity. The Seal of Solomon was thought very likely to be a ring made out of brass and iron. And King Solomon of Israel used this ring apparently for several means. The ring allegedly was absolutely beautiful. It was engraved with the words, "Most Great Name of God." It was decorated with these 4 precious gems that represented Solomon's control over the 4 elements, and allowed Solomon to communicate with and control spirits and stuff like demons, genies, and to grant protection and safety to people, and speak with animals like Dr. Dolittle, and perform rituals. It was really like a jack-of-all-trades ring. But we don't have any physical evidence that the ring existed. It's in legends, it's in accounts, it's been written about, but we don't have anything that resembles the ring on hand physically. And again, with a lot of these, maybe it was destroyed over time, maybe it was just lost, forgotten, buried under the ground, or maybe it's at the bottom of a lake somewhere, bottom of a river, but it remains one of the most mysterious, seemingly powerful objects or artifacts in history. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is marshmallow and fennel tea, and join me as we explore part 2, of the legendary artifacts Iceberg. In tier 1, we have the highly requested, it seems, Durandal. But this was a very interesting weapon, which was a sword of a man named Roland, and he was a legendary paladin from 8th century France. And Roland fought for and under Charlemagne, this man right here, but Durandal the sword was said to be incredibly hard, incredibly durable, sharp, and in some accounts actually was on fire. Now, the meaning and origin of the name Durandal isn't entirely understood. There are some theories saying that it derives from the word durable and enduring. So, durable, enduring, Durandal. So that's one possibility. Another suggests that it comes from the words durant and then dale, or I guess this is flipped, so it would be durant dale, but that would mean sharp scythe. So that's another possibility, that it was just a sharp cutting sword. Another possibility might be the old French kind of mistranslated ardent, which might mean something close to flame or flaming, hence the legends of this flaming sword. There's also the Arabic this word, which I am not gonna try and pronounce, but this would mean master of stone, on account of this sword, you know, slicing through and destroying mountains and stones, which we will get into in just a little bit. But as you can see, a very, very cool legendary sword. Lots of, I think, possibilities for the origin of its name. And as for the origin of the sword itself, it has just as many, if not more, explanations. Some say that Charlemagne himself actually originally owned the sword, and then, you know, gave it over to Roland. Some say the European legendary smith Wayland himself crafted it. Some say it was given down from the gods and then passed down through the generations. But all we do know for sure is that Roland owned the sword. He used it in many battles, in many fights, eventually using it in the Battle of Roswell, which I think is the one he's most known for. It's the most famous one. And in it, he basically saves the French army. He saves Charlemagne, but in the process gets himself surrounded, fatally wounded, and he ends up dying. But he didn't want the Saracen army to get Durandal, so according to the legend, he tried to actually destroy the sword by smashing it directly against marble. But obviously that didn't work. Like, hello, legendary sword here, what's a bit of marble gonna do? But here there are kind of different versions of the legend. Some say he just fell down and died and kind of hid the sword underneath him. Or my favorite account of what happened is that Roland couldn't destroy the sword, and the swipes from this sword actually cleaved the top of these mountains. In some accounts, it actually divides like a hole out of this mountain. And so, to help him hide the sword, he called upon Saint Michael. And Saint Michael came down, he gave Roland the strength to throw the sword, and he threw the sword several hundred kilometers in that direction, across the border into France, where it got embedded into the side of a mountain, and that is where Durandal came to rest. That was until it was apparently stolen by Henry the Young King in 1183. So the local people made a replica, they put it back into the rock, and then that was stolen, and then they made another replica and then shoved it into the rock. And basically the replicas just kept being stolen from this spot, with the last one stolen actually being in June of 2024, which I'll admit, it might be a pretty cool souvenir to keep, and I'm not condoning stealing. But we don't know where the original sword is. We don't really know where any of the replicas are, although the sword and the legend behind it, I think, are very cool. Tutankhamun's meteoric iron dagger is so freaking cool. And it was this famous dagger made out of iron and owned by King Tut of Egypt in around the 1300s BC. But what makes this dagger really, really cool is the particular molecular makeup of it, in that the iron found inside of this dagger is very, very, very similar to the iron found in meteorites. Because this iron dagger, while yes, mostly iron, is also comprised of about 11% nickel. And every other iron artifact that we found kind of in history that was maybe dug up from the ground, smelted into something, these never really exceed around 4%. Whereas meteoric iron, you know, iron that's come directly from a meteor, that normally ranges between 5 and 35%. And as a reminder, this dagger sits at around 11%. So it very, very likely actually came from a meteor. And if that's not like the coolest thing that you could have owned at the time, then I don't know what is. Like literal space dagger. And bear in mind, this was actually in the time of the Bronze Age. So they hadn't really even started mass producing iron, mass mining iron. You know, they were still using bronze for most of their things, most of their smelting and weapons, etc. Iron at the time was actually more expensive than gold, just because of how rare it was. And so they often would only really use iron for like royal gifts, little trinkets, little decorations sort of thing. And so just having an iron dagger on its own was already rare and expensive and awesome, let alone a meteoric iron dagger. Then, of course, the Bronze Age collapse happened, which check out my Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg videos if you want to learn a little bit more about that. It is truly a fascinating topic. But after the Bronze Age collapse, in came the Iron Age, in came mining iron, smelting it, and so iron daggers were less and less rare, less and less impressive. But this meteoric dagger, I think, will remain one of my favorite artifacts of all time. The Baghdad Battery refers to these 3 items found near Baghdad in 1938. And when these 3 items are combined together, they are thought to form a super early rudimentary battery. And this was from the Parthian period, so around 200 BC. And these 3 items are a clay jar, which provides sort of the housing for the battery, a copper cylinder that sits inside of the jar, and an iron rod that goes inside the cylinder. And when this jar was filled with a electrolyte sort of liquid, so think lemon juice, vinegar, that sort of thing, it's possible that this was actually capable of producing a small electrical charge. Now, what exactly that charge might have been used for, we're not entirely sure. There are some people that theorize that this is evidence, this is proof of like these ancient, super advanced civilizations that ran their entire underground cities on these batteries, or maybe on more advanced batteries. You know, they used to have iPhones 5,000 years ago. But I think a more likely theory is that 1, they were either just kind of experimenting, they were messing around with these things, or 2, they used it for something called electroplating, which is a process by which you can use a battery to basically transfer small layers of one metal onto another metal. And it's a very cool process all in all, honestly, but you can use this to increase the durability of a certain metal or to increase the resistances of it. Perhaps one metal is harder than another, perhaps one resists rust better than another, or just as a form of decoration to kind of change the look and feel of whatever metal you want. It's a very cool process. Look into it a little bit if you want to be impressed. And the Baghdad battery, I think, is a very cool artifact. As I said, we're not entirely sure what it was actually used for, but hopefully someday soon we can actually find some more of these. The Rosetta Stone is somewhat of a well-known artifact, I would say, but it's still to this day absolutely amazes me every time I read about it. And it was found in 1799 in Egypt during a campaign run by Napoleon Bonaparte. And when it was found, it was an absolutely groundbreaking discovery, because on this stone are 3 direct translations of the same text, the same message, but in 3 different languages. It was a decree written by a council of priests affirming the 13-year-old king Ptolemy V in 196 BC. And you had this same decree written in ancient Egyptian, so, you know, in hieroglyphs, and in ancient Greek, and in something called demotic. Now, the hieroglyphs weren't used in kind of day-to-day work. You know, they were used more in like official ceremonies or for engraving, kind of maybe like how we use Latin today. Demotic was basically what the modern in those days Egyptians used. So day-to-day, they would speak in demotic, they would write their messages in it. And then there was ancient Greek, obviously the official language of ancient Greece at the time, but also of the Egyptian administration, because, you know, of the influence of Greece, of the Ptolemy line of rulers originally coming from Greece. And so all of these things combined kind of explained why there were 3 different versions of this. And as you can imagine, when this stone was first discovered, we knew a good chunk of ancient Greek, we knew a little bit less demotic, and we knew even less in ancient hieroglyphs. So this was like Google Translate in the ancient times, it gave us a bunch of knowledge about what certain words and letters and orderings meant, etc. And this one discovery has helped us still to this day in figuring out the translations of these ancient languages. The Dead Sea Scrolls. So these were found between 1946 and 1956 in and around the Dead Sea, hence the name. But these were these ancient Jewish manuscripts and scrolls that had seemingly been written out, scrolled up into these clay jars, and hidden deep in these caves all around the area. And in these scrolls, we find some of the oldest surviving fragments of, for example, the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh and the Old Testament, as well as various other religious texts linking to early Christianity. And honestly, if this sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend checking out a documentary on it, or just reading a bit further into the actual texts found here, as there are just far too many to go over in this short video. But they include, for example, the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is the longest, best preserved, oldest Old Testament script ever found, containing the entire book of Isaiah. There's a scroll detailing the rules and laws of a Jewish community at the time, the Qumran community. And they were a sect of Jews who lived kind of on the outskirts of the Dead Sea. And so you have their local rules and customs, etc. And this kind of gave us more evidence as to what they liked about the other Jews, what they disliked about them, how they saw Judaism was at the time. And this was all from around 150 BC all the way up to around 50 AD. So around 200 years, but it also spans over kind of early Christianity at the time. So if you want to take a read of it, I will leave a English translation down below, or a link to the English translation. But before these scrolls were found, the earliest version of the Old Testament that we had was actually a Greek translation. And this Greek translation had actually been translated itself based on an earlier Hebrew or Aramaic Old Testament, and then this one got lost. The Greek one was all that we had, and then that was translated either into English or to Hebrew or to whatever. And so another thing was that when these scrolls were found, they actually revealed that a bunch of the Greek translations were kind of inaccurate. You know, they didn't do a terrible job, but there were kind of one or two words that were kind of flipped here or there, like the word virgin, for example, originally just being young woman, the sons of Israel being just originally the sons of God in the Dead Sea Scrolls version, as well as many other differences. And if that wasn't enough, we still haven't gone through all of these scrolls that we've discovered, because as you can imagine, these are very old scrolls. They are furled up, rolled up in these jars or pots or whatever. And so just the act of opening the jar in some cases could destroy the scrolls, but especially, you know, taking them out, unfurling them. And so a bunch of them have been kept for, you know, the last 100 years. And only now we're just starting to develop technology that can basically read the content of these scrolls from outside the jar without having even to unfurl them, which is just fascinating, and I am very excited to see what else might be on these scrolls. The Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch is, before anyone gives me hell in the comments, not a real artifact, but it's from one of my favorite films of all time, a film I'm sure you all know and love, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But this weapon is incredibly powerful. It comes with a set of instructions to use, and when it's first introduced, it is accompanied by the following text from the Book of Armaments, being, "And Saint Attila raised the grenade up on high, saying, O Lord, bless this thy hand grenade, that with it thou mayest blow up thine enemies, 2 tiny bits in thy mercy. And the people did feast upon the lambs, and sloths, and carp, and anchovies, and orangutans, and breakfast cereals, and fruit bats, and large chalupas," which is this thing, by the way. Then they skip a bit, the text goes on to read, "And the Lord spake, saying, First shalt thou take out the holy pin. Then shalt thou count to 3, no more, no less. 3 shall be the number thou shalt count to, and the number of the counting shall be 3. 4 shalt thou not count to, neither count thou 2, excepting that thou then proceed to 3. And 5 is right out. Once the number 3, being the third number, be reached, then lobbest thou thy holy hand grenade of Antioch towards thy foe, who, being naughty in my sight, shall snuff it." And this was all, of course, during the battle with the outstandingly deadly and vicious killer rabbit of Kerbenog, who was known to jump at least 8 feet in the air and rip out someone's jugular, even decapitating them before they even knew which side of Tuesday was up. So a very, very deadly critter and a very fun entry. Tier 2, Goliath's Sword. So in the famous battle with the underdog young Jewish shepherd David versus the huge legendary Philistine warrior Goliath, David beats Goliath in single combat, armed with only a sling and a rock. But after he won the fight, David grabbed Goliath's sword and he beheaded Goliath. And then took Goliath's sword, dedicated it to God as like thanks for winning the battle. And then he donates the sword to a city of priests. These priests then give David back the sword a little later on when he needs a weapon. And after that, we don't really know what happens to it. And there are some very, very interesting, fascinating theories here involving the Tuatha De Danann and the Scythian people and ancient Irish mythology, which we will cover in a little bit more detail a little further down. But just know for now that the Tuatha De Danann were a group of people, foreigners, invaders, who were, according to legend, somewhat magical. They came from somewhere, we don't really know where. They invaded Ireland, and they weren't unique in this. They weren't the only people who did. Another group was, for example, the Firbolg, who were apparently from Greece, the Milesians from Spain, as well as many, many other people. But these Tuatha De Danann, according to some theories, were actually the Scythian people, a nomadic warrior tribe who came from this sort of region and were actually descendants of Israel. And so this long, convoluted theory says that David, who was an Israelite, kept the sword of Goliath, or Goliath's sword, and he kept it within his people. He kind of passed it down from person to person. Some of these people eventually went off and became the Scythians, and importantly, they took the sword with them. Then they migrated all over the place, as nomads tend to do. They ended up in Ireland, settling there, making their home there, and these Scythian people are what spurred on the legend of the Tuatha De Danann. And with them, they brought not only the sword of Goliath, but also many, many other legendary artifacts, a few of which we will get into a little bit further down. The Wallace sword is this lovely, beautiful sword said to have belonged to William Wallace, who was the legendary knight who led the Scottish resistance against the English in the late 1200s. And William Wallace, after this revolt, was executed in 1305. And it is said at the time that a local governor actually received the sword. Then it kind of fell out of the records. There are accounts like 200 years later stating that King James IV of Scotland actually commissioned an armorer to repair this sword. You know, to touch it up a little bit, create a new hilt, create a scabbard and a belt for it. And then there's again nothing for like 3 centuries until a letter was found in 1825 stating that this sword was being sent to the Tower of London for repairs. And the sword is currently being stored and displayed in the National Wallace Monument in Stirling, Scotland. And we're honestly not entirely sure if this is the original sword. You know, the one that belonged to Wallace. It may very well be. It might have been changed out over the years. It might have been destroyed and replaced or stolen or what have you. But let me know your thoughts on this one down below. Prydwen was one of the many artifacts of King Arthur, and this was a shield decorated with the image of the Mother Mary. And according to legend, any sword or weapon or anything that struck this shield would just immediately shatter, which honestly, it sounds pretty helpful. But since it is a Arthurian legend, we're not too sure if this shield ever actually existed, or whether the legend was based on an actual shield, or some combination of the two. And if it did ever exist, we're not entirely sure where it is today. Akkad refers to this ancient city and capital of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. And the strange thing is, we know that this city existed, as it has been referenced many times. Its location has been hinted at, but we've never actually found the city or its exact location. As I said, we've taken kind of clues from various sources that say, okay, this city was like near X river, and then another source would say that this city lay east of somewhere or west of another place. And so we have kind of triangulated its position to somewhere in this sort of region, but there are some major problems with actually finding this city. The first problem, probably the major problem, is that a city this large and this old very likely would be buried quite deep, and so it might just be located underneath a very heavily built up area in somewhere like Baghdad, meaning you can't really go digging around, at least not very efficiently. And two, a lot of the references to the location of the city are in reference to the Tigris River, and it is thought that the river itself has moved about over the years. So even if it were to the east of the river, 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, is a very old city, it's likely the river has kind of morphed and changed over that time, and so the references are becoming just less and less useful. It is a fascinating topic. I do kind of have faith, if not hope, that the city will be found eventually, as God knows what we'll discover under there, but only time will tell. The sandals of Jesus were said to be, well, Jesus's sandals that were donated to the Prum Abbey by Pepin the Short. And this was all the way back in the 750s, and they remain in this abbey to this day. They were said to have been a gift from Roman Pope Stephen II, and they were given to Pepin the Short, which he then donated them. But the lineage of these sandals before this, all the way back to apparently the life of Jesus, if they were in fact his sandals, is unfortunately a little unclear. The Sword of Islam. So after Italian dictator Mussolini occupied Libya, he declared himself the protector of Islam, and he was gifted what was called the Sword of Islam by a man named Yusuf Kerisk, who was a Berber leader in northern Africa, who obviously supported Mussolini's occupation of Libya. And this sword was pretty cool. It was a pretty good sword. Notably, parts of it were crafted from gold, which made it a very valuable sword. But when Mussolini fell from power, the sword kind of disappeared. It's never turned up since. And so we don't know if it was stolen or lost or destroyed, melted down for lunch money or something. But that is the Sword of Islam. The Shield of Achilles. So back in ancient Greece, Homer, not that guy, but Homer was a poet, he was a writer, and he wrote two famous stories which you might have heard of, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And within them is the story of Achilles, who, as you all might know, was dipped into the river Styx, making him completely invulnerable. Except when his mum dipped him into this river. I guess she didn't want to get her hands wet, so she didn't dip all of him in. She just grabbed him by the ankle, dipped him in, so he was more or less completely invulnerable. But because his ankle didn't technically go in the river, that was his one weakness, or his Achilles heel. And of course, because of this, in the story, he was then shot through the ankle with an arrow, and he ended up succumbing and dying, which firstly, that is not a responsible way to dip a baby in a river. I mean, not that you should be, dipping many babies in rivers, but if you are gonna dip a baby in a river, probably don't do it by just grabbing the end of one ankle. But Achilles was a legendary warrior in these stories, and so he naturally had many legendary artifacts. And one of those artifacts was his shield. And this shield is really quite beautiful. It is described in the Iliad, and it depicts on the shield these murals almost of the earth, the sun, the sky, the sea, the moon and stars and people and buildings, cities, houses, just all sorts. But where this shield is or whether it ever existed, we don't currently know. The Irish crown jewels. So these are these gorgeous, voluptuous pieces of jewelry that were created in 1831 for the Grand Master of the Irish Knights Order of St. Patrick in Ireland. And they were kept in Dublin Castle until 1907, when they were stolen and haven't been seen since. And these black and white photos don't really do the jewels justice. They were crafted with green emeralds forming this shamrock shape. They had red rubies in. Their motto was like engraved with pink diamonds. Then they also had regular diamonds thrown in there. And all in all, each piece of jewelry was worth, in today's money, just over around maybe £2 million, $2.5 million US, or $5 million for the pair of them. And the whole case surrounding these jewels and surrounding the theft is just absolutely wild. As I said, these jewels were kept in the Dublin Castle, and they were kept under the protection of the Ulster King of Arms, Sir Arthur Vickers, who was known apparently to get very drunk and was even said to have woken up one day after a night of drinking, a night of lollygagging all over the place, and woke up with the jewels around his neck and no memory of how they even got there. And so, after these jewels went missing, a few people naturally blamed Arthur. Arthur blamed his second in command, Frank Shackleton, and the commission investigating this eventually found no one guilty of the theft, but did find Arthur guilty of misconduct, of not exercising proper vigilance in protecting these jewels, as he was the protector and watcher of them after all. And interestingly enough, Frank Shackleton was actually the brother of a man named Ernest Shackleton, who was the famous explorer and survivor of the Antarctic, and we will be covering his story in an upcoming video. But this investigation basically went back and forth, Arthur blaming Frank, saying he set him up, he got him drunk, and this didn't really go anywhere. And one of the reasons why perhaps it didn't go anywhere was there was a deeper political subplot surrounding this whole theft, surrounding the Dublin Castle, as it was thought that Frank was involved in and had information and knowledge about what were called at the time the Dublin Castle homosexual scandals of 1884, which, as you can imagine, was more taboo in those sorts of days, and involved, sex parties within the castle. It involved bringing prostitutes in regularly, and it was very likely the case that because Frank knew about all of this, he knew the names of perhaps some high-up officials, maybe he had threatened to kind of spill the beans if anyone prosecuted him. It is thought that that was a major reason why he was never convicted, or at least why he was never investigated, because there wasn't any solid evidence linking Frank to this case or to this theft. But even though there were investigations still going on, somewhat passively, this case has never been solved, and these fantastic, beautiful Irish jewels were never found. The Piri Reis map is a 1513 world map created by Ottoman explorer and admiral Piri Reis. And it's really a wonderful little map, at least what we have left of it, as what you see on screen is basically all we have. There's roughly 2/3 of the world missing from this map, which were, as far as we can tell, just lost to time. It was gifted in 1517 to the Ottoman Sultan by Piri Reis himself, and then we don't really know what happened to it until it was rediscovered in 1929. And it really is one of the more fascinating maps from the 16th century. And there are more accurate world maps from around this time, but I think the uniqueness behind the Piri-Reis map is what makes it so fascinating. For one, the sources that Piri used for his map were unusually diverse, especially for the Muslim world at the time, because it was slightly, a faux pas. It was like slightly taboo for, if you were in the Islamic world, to use Western sources for stuff like this, because it was kind of understood that the Muslim world is superior. We have better scientists, better explorers, better map makers, and so they would typically keep a lot of their sources within the Muslim world. But Piri-Reis used Portuguese maps. He used an Arabic map of India. He likely also used an early version of a Christopher Columbus map to help with the mapping of South America. And it is thought he likely got this Christopher Columbus map from a navy battle he fought in the 1500s. And after winning that battle, he captured a particular Spaniard. And this Spaniard had apparently been on Christopher Columbus's voyage. And with him, he very likely had one of his maps. But as well as those, he used many charts, many smaller maps, many ideas and references, etc. And on top of that, Piri-Reis's map kind of goes against the generally accepted Islamic idea that was often seen on world maps or maps at the time, being the world ocean or world river, which was this giant body of water that basically encircled the earth. So this Piri-Reis map was like a beautiful melding sort of the Islamic world and all of its knowledge, but also of the Western world, European ideas and maps. And yes, there are some things that he got wrong on this map. There are some land masses and islands that he missed. There are some ones that he put in which don't actually exist, but that is all absolutely to be expected with a world map from this sort of age, which, bear in mind, this was in the age of exploration. They didn't have Google Maps set up yet. Christopher Columbus had just only recently made his way over to South America. North America wouldn't be settled by Europeans for another 50 years. And Australia and the Atlantic wouldn't be discovered for another 250 years. I'll leave this translated version up if you want to pause the video and read it. I'll also leave a link down below if you want to check it out and give it a little read. But it was a super fascinating artifact. Balmung is the sword that legendary warrior and hero Sigurd used to kill Fafnir, who was a great dragon or worm in Germanic folklore. And it's a pretty cool sword. Sigurd's carrying it here, as you can see, looking like a fish for some reason. A fish with arms and legs. And all of Sigurd's weapons, this one included, was said to glow bright and gold and may or may not have had a dragon emblazoned on it. And according to legend, Sigurd received this sword when his father Sigmund, during his sister's wedding feast, witnessed a strange man walk in, grab his sword, and jam it into a nearby tree. And he declared, whoever shall pull this sword from this tree shall be the rightful owner and wielder, and shall be allowed to keep it. But what they didn't know at the time was that this strange old man was actually Odin himself. And everyone came up, they tried to pull the sword out of the tree, everyone failed except Sigmund, and he grabbed the sword, pulled it out, and so was allowed to keep it. So eventually after this, the king of the area, he gets jealous of Sigmund. He kills Sigmund's father, he captures his family, and then Sigmund takes this sword and basically goes John Wick on the king, hunting him down, using the sword, killing people, until eventually Odin himself breaks the sword in two. Then, fast forward years later, Sigmund's son Sigurd is training as a blacksmith, and he learns of the great dragon Fafnir that he then decides to slay. But to slay this dragon, he kind of needs a sword, and it may as well be legendary if you're going to fight a great dragon. So after many attempts at, blacksmithing his own legendary sword, in the end he just decides to forge together these two broken halves, and Balmung, his father's legendary weapon, is whole once again. It's sharp, it's beautiful, it's legendary, and Sigurd does, in the end up slaying Fafnir with it. Muramasa was a legendary Japanese blacksmith who was responsible for making some pretty gnarly weapons, daggers, samurai swords, katanas that were impressively unique, high quality, good level of craftsmanship, and he also founded the school of Muramasa. And the school itself spanned for like 3 generations, and some of Muramasa's students from the school actually went on to create legendary weapons of their own, like for example the Tonbikiri, one of the 3 great spears of Japan, and the Inoshishigiri, or the Boar Slayer. And although we don't know too much about Muramasa as an individual, it is rumored that he might have been a student of Masamune, who himself was said to be the greatest swordsmith in all of Japanese history. Tier 3 Vitrum Flexile, or flexible glass, and this was apparently invented in ancient Rome during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. According to the account, the inventor came up to Tiberius himself and he brought him a glass drinking bowl and challenged Tiberius to get the glass bowl and smash it. But after a solid attempt, this glass bowl simply, bent a little bit, it dented, it didn't shatter, and then this man went up to it with a small hammer and knocked it back into shape, and apparently it seemed as good as new. He swore that he was the only sole inventor of this glass, and that he alone in the entire world had knowledge of the recipe. And then immediately after this, Tiberius had this man beheaded, meaning this incredible technology was basically lost forever, at least as far as the legend goes. People say that Tiberius might have done this for various reasons, maybe to protect the interests of, big glass. So all the people that were making money out of glass manufacturing, he didn't want to put them out of business with this new technology, this new invention, or because he thought this material might have been so valuable that it would have debased his own currencies, it would have debased gold and silver, etc., and he didn't want that, so he just killed the man. Was this perhaps alien technology, or an early discovery of something like plastic, or was it genuinely, truly flexible glass? Let me know your thoughts on this down below. And just a quick reminder, folks, that good things come to those who subscribe. I am very close to hitting my goal of 50,000 subscribers, and if this video gets more than 2 likes, I will release the part 3 finale. Kusanagi no Tsurugi is a legendary royal sword of Japan that is said to have been obtained from the tail of Yamata no Orochi, who was the legendary 8-headed or 8-tailed serpent. And apparently, according to this legend, this serpent or dragon had consumed 7 of this man's 8 daughters, and the dragon was coming for his 8th daughter. So the god Susanoo came and promised to kill this dragon, essentially to protect this man's family, only if this man gave his final daughter to this god, so they could get married. And so the father thought this was a good idea. He agreed to this deal. The god Susanoo then took this daughter, transformed her into a comb so that he could wear the comb in his hair, and she could be with him while he was battling this dragon, which, okay. But he did go and fight this dragon. He ended up slaying the dragon and chopping off each of the dragon's heads, and then chopping off each of its tails. And it was inside the dragon's 4th tail that Susanoo apparently discovered this great weapon, the Kusanagi no Tsurugi. It was then passed down through the generations until the great warrior Yamato Tamago got his hands on it. And this legendary warrior later on got kind of lured into this trap. This warlord lured Yamato into this field. He killed Yamato's horse and then set the entire field surrounding Yamato on fire. But just as there was no hope left, Yamato ended up using this legendary sword to basically cut all of the grass around him, stopping the fire and saving his life. But Yamato also discovered a kind of special ability, special power of this sword, was that it could control wind. And so while these flames were all around him, he cut the grass, saved himself, but also used it to like shoot the wind back at this warlord, and with the wind came the flame, and that spelled the end of this warlord. And so after this legendary battle, the sword was named Kusanagi no Tsurugi, or the grass cutting sword, as before this the sword was named Amemo Morokumo no Tsurugi, or the heavenly sword of gathering clouds. It has apparently been kept in the Atsuta shrine since the 12th century, but it has not been publicly displayed there. They won't, reveal it or show it to anyone, as it is apparently so precious, so rare and holy and divine, and so we don't know for sure that it is still kept there, but that is the official status of it, at least for now. The Book of Thoth is honestly a very interesting entry. So the Egyptian god Thoth was similar in many ways to the Greek god Hermes. They both invented writing. They were both gods of similar things: knowledge, messages, wisdom. Thoth was also the god of magic and the moon for some reason, which, we'll throw that in as well. But the ancient Book of Thoth was said to contain, and I quote, all knowledge of laws, magic, nature, and the afterlife, and contained 2 spells, one of which allowed the person to understand animal languages, which is pretty useful, and another one which allowed them to perceive the gods themselves, which, that's also pretty useful. And the legend goes that Thoth wrote this book himself, and it was hidden at the bottom of the Nile, locked inside a series of boxes guarded by snakes, which is like ancient high security, I guess. An Egyptian prince then discovered these books. He fought off the snakes. He secured this knowledge for himself. But as punishment for stealing this Book of Thoth, both his wife and his son were killed. He then died as well a little later on and was buried with this book. Years later, another person tries to, take this book from the guy's tomb, and he is then met with terrible misfortunes and trickery and illusions. And so eventually this new man then takes the book and returns it, with the moral of the story kind of being that, this knowledge is only meant for the gods. It's perhaps something similar to the, Adam and Eve story. And the term Book of Thoth is also discussed in a wider meaning, because generally the done thing at the time was that because Thoth was the god of knowledge, the god of wisdom, the god of writing, a lot of the manuscripts and texts and books, etc., that were written by, priests or scribes or pretty much anyone were attributed to Thoth. So in their eyes, because Thoth was the originator of knowledge and wisdom, he basically got credit for anything they wrote down. And so a lot of these books, these manuscripts, these texts, which were written by humans, by scribes or priests or what have you, they were penned as being written by Thoth. And so you often have anything written by Thoth being included in the Book of Thoth. And hopefully that wasn't too confusing. The 7-branched sword is this gnarly looking cactus sort of sword.
In 18 BC, Baekje was founded in a
that was apparently a gift from the king of Baekje, which was an old Korean kingdom, to a Yamamoto ruler, which Yamamoto being an area in old Japan. And this was all in roughly the 3rd century. And the 7-branched sword has some inscriptions on the sword. This on one side, this on another. And what's that? You don't speak Chinese? Oh, alright. So these are the English translations of these inscriptions, and you may want to pause to read them, but they basically list when the sword was made and how cool and high quality and amazing the sword is, and it has been kept since apparently forever in the Isonokami Shrine in Japan. It's not currently on public display, but it is very likely still there. And yeah, very cool, unique looking sword. The Guy Bulka spear of Cuchulainn was a legendary spear in Old Irish, meaning belly spear, or meaning spear of mortal death, which is a fantastic name for a weapon. But this was the spear of Cuchulainn, who was a great Irish warrior and demigod in Irish mythology. And honestly, the mythology and stories and tales behind this are absolutely fantastic. It was apparently made from the bones of a legendary sea monster, and this sea monster died while fighting another legendary sea monster. And when this spear was used, it would fly into, whoever you threw it at. It would go into their bodies, and then it would open up into 30 barbed mini spears, basically completely lodging it wherever you threw it, or into whoever you threw it. Or is it whomever? But it was said that the only way then to remove this spear was to cut it out of the unfortunate victim, basically ensuring that you killed them in the process. Yeesh, or quiche. Some versions of the legend say that there were 7 spears that came out. So, you threw the original spear, it opened up into 7 mini spears, and then each of those mini spears opened up itself into 7 mini spears, and so you just have a lot of spears within this weapon. Nerja's Universal Ring is a ring in Chinese mythology, also known as the Chan Kun Ring, and this was used by Nerja, who was a legendary figure. He was a protector of Buddhism, of Taoism, of general folklore, and he is often depicted in his teenager or childlike form. The ring was gifted to him by his powerful mentor. It was made of gold. It could grow or shrink depending on, its will. And it was completely indestructible and very often killed whoever it was thrown at. People, deities, dragons, demons, basically anything and anyone. And in case you didn't think that was powerful enough, it could also suppress enemies, it could tie them up, neutralize them, it could also just kind of bonk into people and mountains and not necessarily slice through them or kill them, but just make a giant smash, maybe an earthquake. And once again is on the growing list, I think, of just insanely overpowered legendary weapons. Marmiados is a legendary weapon from the Arthur tales that was actually said to be more powerful and more brilliant than Excalibur. Marmiados was generally wielded by King Rion in Ireland, who was a giant, by the way. Just thought I'd throw that in there. But basically, King Arthur is fighting King Rion. King Rion gets his sword, Marmiados. He slams it down on King Arthur, and it hits into and gets lodged into Arthur's shield. Then, because it's lodged in there, Arthur is then able to, get around, kill King Rion, and he takes his sword, Marmiados, and actually starts using it himself, preferring to instead lend Excalibur to his nephew Sir Gawain, showing just how much better Marmiados was. Some say Marmiados was forged by the Roman god of fire, or that it was originally owned by Hercules and then passed down through the ages, but truth be told, no one's entirely sure of the origins of this mythical weapon. Clarent is another sword from the Arthurian tales, and as with a lot of these Arthurian artifacts, doesn't get talked about quite as often as Excalibur. But this Clarent sword was incredibly important, not necessarily for battles or for fighting, but for the various ceremonies. It was symbolic of the strength of the kingdom, of the peace and diplomacy that it had set up. But after Mordred, Arthur's nephew, stole this sword, he actually used it to kill Arthur in a fight, which is pretty ironic for a sword of peace and diplomacy. The sword with the red hilt, which is once again another Arthurian artifact, and this was a sword that was also tied in with misfortune, with curses and bad luck, etc. And according to the legend, the sword was brought to King Arthur's court, but with it being declared that only the most exceptional knight would be able to remove this sword from its scabbard and wield it. And that knight ended up being Sir Balin. But as I said, later down the road, it leads to kind of curses, to misfortune, and this leads to Sir Balin and his brother accidentally killing each other in a fight, marking it, I think, forever as a very unfortunate sort of bad luck sword. Honjo Masamune. So we briefly touched on Masamune earlier, the legendary greatest swordsmith in all of Japanese history. And the Honjo Masamune was a sword that he actually created. And it was named this later on after the general Honjo Shigenaga. And the sword itself was crafted obviously in Masamune's period, so like the 12 to 1300s, and was picked up by some means by this general Honjo, after whom the sword was appropriately named. Then it was passed down from warrior to warrior, shogun to shogun, until eventually it was declared a Japanese national treasure in 1939, and was then handed over to the United States after World War II, and then just completely disappeared. We have records of it being handed over, or confiscated or taken or what have you, because Japan lost World War II, but we don't have any records for where it went or what happened to it. Whether it was stolen, hidden, lost, destroyed, we simply don't know. Hopefully it does turn up one day, because I think it is a very cool Japanese artifact, but that is the Honjo Masamune. The Antikythera mechanism is a fantastic mechanism found at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea in a Greek shipwreck from around 100 BC, or over 2,000 years ago, and it is widely considered to be the earliest found evidence of an analog computer. Now, when I say the word computer, it wasn't like modern day computers. It didn't have Skype and Sims and Minesweeper or Skyrim on, but it was a computer in that it computed. So it computed stuff like the moving of stars, the tracking of the sun and the moon, potentially the tracking of the planets, predicting of eclipses, and was likely used as some sort of moving calendar, which is just insane for 100 BC. The ancient Greeks were truly phenomenal. You can imagine what this sort of device would have looked like, brand new, in working condition, with little cranks and cogs and things turning around, tracking the movement of, all the celestial bodies somewhat perfectly. And while there are a few theories about who might have made this or invented it, from Archimedes to Hipparchus to just crediting a bunch of the ancient Greek schools at the time, it's not likely we'll ever pinpoint an exact creator for it, but it is kept on display in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens if you're ever there and you want to pop in and check it out. The 9 tripod cauldrons. So these were these 9 cauldrons, not these ones, as these are just recreations of the originals, but these 9 cauldrons were basically the symbol of the divine right to rule, and they were basically owned and kept by whoever was ruling China at any particular time. So first they were made and kept by the Xia dynasty, which we will touch on them in just a little bit, but then they got overthrown by the Shang dynasty. The cauldrons were passed down. Then the Zhou dynasty took over, and once again the cauldrons were passed down. But the legend goes that the founder and the leader of the Xia dynasty, named Yu the Great, the legend goes that he divided China up into 9 provinces and took, among many other things, bronze tributes from each province. And with each of the bronze tributes that he received, he made a cauldron. And so with these 9 cauldrons, it kind of represented the unity of China. It represented his rule over all of the 9 provinces. And this legend is interesting because the Xia dynasty, that was apparently ruled by Yu the Great. The Xia dynasty itself is kind of somewhat mythical. We don't actually have any physical records of the Xia dynasty, as the earliest writing from China we have is from the Shang dynasty, which was the one dynasty after the Xia dynasty. But how we came to know about the Xia dynasty was really from texts and speeches found from the Zhou dynasty, which was the one after the Shang dynasty. So you've got the Xia, the Shang, and then the Zhou. And there's text from the Zhou dynasty saying that we are justified in taking over power from the Shang dynasty, just as the Shang dynasty was justified in taking power from the Xia dynasty. But as I said, we've never actually found anything physical from the Xia dynasty. There are some theories to suggest that the Xia dynasty might be kind of one and the same as something called the Erlitou culture, which was a group of people who lived around this sort of region who we do have physical evidence for, and they do share some similarities with what might be the Xia dynasty, but this connection, this link between the two isn't entirely proven. But after the Zhou dynasty was then taken over again by the Qin dynasty, which a lot of dynasties, I know, but after the Zhou dynasty fell, these cauldrons basically went missing. We don't know if they were destroyed or melted down, or the new dynasty didn't like these traditions from the old dynasties. But either way, those are the 9 legendary cauldrons. Leonardo's robot. Is this robot, machine, mechanical man created by Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century? And it should be stated that this is just a recreation, and we're not sure if Leonardo himself actually ever built something like this. But these schematics were found in the 1950s, like 400 years after Leonardo da Vinci wrote them, and we then followed the schematics and built out these prototypes of our own. As you can see, the design is basically done within a suit of armor, and the idea was to use the suit of armor, you know, as like a frame, and then you have the mechanics inside, moving the arms, moving the legs, tilting the neck and head back and forth, and depending on how complex you want to get, could actually move the arms in, you know, all sorts of degrees, could move the hands, the fingers, could grab things. And yeah, so a very cool artifact, a very cool invention and design by, once again, our main man, Leonardo da Vinci. Gungnir is a pretty basic one. It is just the Spear of Odin, basically, which is talked about probably less than Thor's Meow Meow. But this crazy powerful spear always hit its target whenever it was thrown, and this was regardless of the skill or the strength of the thrower. So you could literally have like a baby pick up this spear, or an ant, and then throw it at whoever the ant intended to hit, probably another ant or a wasp. I don't really know who ants hate. Termites, maybe? But it would fly straight and true to that target, always hitting it every single time. The spear was created by dwarven blacksmith masters called the Sons of Ivaldi, and actually after this spear was made, Loki made a bet with some other dwarves and basically said that there was no way that they could create something as glorious and amazing as the Sons of Ivaldi had created. And in arranging this little like competition, this bet, out of it came the Boar of Freya, the Ring of Odin, and the Hammer of Thor, otherwise known as Meow Meow. Joyeuse was the sword used by Charlemagne in all the things he was up to in the 8th century. You know, defending and uniting Europe, being emperor and such and so forth. But it's a pretty gnarly sword. It's pictured here with a later younger sheath or scabbard. And aside from being quite beautiful, it is, as with a lot of these legendary artifacts, kind of tinted in legend and myth, with it being said that the Spear of Longinus, so the spear that was jabbed into Jesus's side, the legend says that a piece of that spear was actually built into the hilt or handle of Joyeuse. Joyeuse, of course, being the French word for joy, which I'm not sure the people being stabbed with this sword would agree with that name, but it is currently on display in the Louvre in France. If you're ever around there and feel like, you know, popping in and taking a look. The Olmec colossal heads. So as far as stone monuments go, these are perhaps some of the least talked about. You know, everyone talks about Stonehenge and Easter Island, but who really knows about the Olmec colossal heads? I mean, I sure don't, or at least I didn't until I researched this entry. But these are these huge, fantastic carvings of stone, and the stone itself that was used to carve these were absolutely massive, huge pieces. They weigh several tons. They were moved in some cases more than 150 kilometers, you know, to get from where they originated over to where they are. And I mean, just walking that distance would take incredibly long. It's like 93 miles, probably like 50 hours of walking. So to move these huge boulders this distance is just insane. And these stones were all located in the Olmec area, so around kind of Mexico, Central America sort of region, and they all seem to have unique headwear or hats, or perhaps helmets, and each of the human individuals seems to also be unique. So it seems maybe somewhat likely that these carvings actually represented like Olmec leaders, maybe rulers, maybe generals of sorts, maybe kings, and their people honored them by carving them into stone. And just as a bonus fact, Olmec was actually one of the 6 cradles of civilization. And so as you can imagine, if like the people in South America start to develop a civilization, and then people in the Middle East develop a civilization, it's not like one civilization caused the other, or that they migrated to one another. They're like completely separate, entirely different civilizations. And so that's why we have these 6 what are called cradles of civilization, which were 6 entirely separate civilizations that popped up all around the world at a fairly early age. And Olmec in Central America was one of them. The others being Sumer in modern-day Iraq, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization around sort of India sort of area, the Erlitou culture, which might have been, as we discussed earlier, the Shah dynasty in around China, and some South American civilizations around the Andes Mountains. Tier 4, the Hope Diamond. So this was this big ass diamond, 45.52 carats. It was a beautiful bluey sort of purpley color, which just looks fantastic. And it is currently kept in the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of National History, which is in Washington, D.C. in America. So that's finally one that my US viewers can realistically go over there and see. But let me know what state you live in down below. And as to why this diamond is so notable, well, obviously it's a huge diamond, it's blue, but it is also thought to be kind of a cursed diamond, or at least bring on some amount of bad luck. There was first records of it in like 1666, which firstly is very long ago, and secondly, if we're talking about bad luck, it was found in 666 or 1666, but this gem might be the work of the devil. I'm just saying. But at the time it was purchased from India. It was uncut, it still had imperfections in, and an Irishman named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, I'm only kidding, Jean-Baptiste was obviously a Frenchman, but he purchased the diamond, he had it cut down a little bit, he had it cleaned up, and that resulted in a gem that looked sort of like this. This was a recreation done based on early drawings of the gem, and he named it the Blue Diamond of France, or the French Blue, or Le Bleu de France. And honestly, I would have kept the gem just like this. To me, this looks absolutely gorgeous. But he then sold the gem to King Louis XIV. King Louis was then, as we all know, beheaded during the French Revolution, after which Le Bleu de France, as well as various other gems, jewelry, royal items of sorts, were all stolen during the revolution, and this gem didn't turn up for another 20 years. And it is highly suspected that whoever stole it basically had it smuggled and transported to London, where it was then cut down even more and crafted into this necklace or pendant. This pendant was then sold on, and it eventually made its way into the possession of the Hope family, who were a rich banking family at the time. And ever since then, it has been named after them, being the Hope Diamond. It then passed on to a few more people before being donated to where it resides today, the Smithsonian Institution's National this place. And as it is currently on display, anyone is free to go in there, take a look. It's a very beautiful gem, but I think it really is quite a shame that it was cut down so much, that it was, you know, cleaned up in a way, which I guess that's the style, to make these nice edges to reflect light in different ways. But I think I do really like the clarity and the cleanliness and the simplicity of the original gem. But as for the curse of the blue diamond, there were some early reports saying that it was stolen from India, and so this is where the curse originated. And there was a 1911 New York Times article that was posted saying that this gem was cursed, and basically listing a bunch of people who had owned the gem or had been in possession of it and had soon after kind of met their fate, dealt with misfortune, and this further encouraged the rumor of it being a cursed diamond. Sword Kladinets is a sword from old Russian folklore that in some cases is a very strong sword, in some a magical sword, and in some kind of a bit of both. It is also understood in some legends to be the very same sword as the mech sword or the self-swinging sword, which just sounds fantastic. Like, imagine you just stick it out and it just swings automatically. You don't even need to move your hand. But as seems to be a kind of recurring theme with a lot of these legendary weapons, especially swords, it was often said that the sword Kladinets was hidden or wedged or stuck inside of a wall or a rock or a stone or a tree or a mountain, and whoever shall be worthy enough to pull it out would then be able to wield it. Pangu's axe is not this axe from Sims, for anyone who plays Sims. Shout out to Chickpea. But Pangu was in Chinese mythology a great primordial being, a god or godlike individual from the Chinese or Taoist creation story. And Pangu, he was himself outside of creation, and he had a giant axe which he used to cleave the creation egg, often called the cosmic egg. And with this one cut, he separated heaven from earth, or the sky from earth. He separated yin from yang, and he himself stood there between the two worlds, basically holding up the sky so that it didn't fall down on earth. And he stayed there for 18,000 years. And then eventually Pangu died, and all the parts of his body and being transformed into different parts of the universe. So this was both his physical body, his head, his arms, his legs, but also his breath, his voice, his eyes, and even his fleas. Literally, the fleas that were on him transformed into bits of the universe. Very cool. So this legend is nothing if not unique. Ireland's Lear Fall is a big rock, and it's a standing stone made of granite located in Ireland, in County Meath if you want to be particular, but it is thought to have been used as the crowning site for many kings of old Ireland. So very cool. It was thought to have been brought here by the Tuatha De Danann, the magical, somewhat mythical divine race of people who we discussed earlier as potentially being the Scythian tribe, you know, who brought Goliath's sword over to Ireland. But it is said that, according to legend, this stone roars or cries out either in the presence of a true king of Ireland or in the presence of a false king of Ireland who is trying to usurp the throne and take power for himself. So it's not entirely useful. It's a bit like having a black marker that turns red whenever you write something that is true, but also whenever you write something that is false. And I think this stone just roared a lot. Very indiscriminate with its roars. But the stone still remains here in Ireland to this day, despite being vandalized many times for whatever reason. Like, I don't know why you'd vandalize a rock, but okay. But that is the Lear Fall. The Skofnung is an awesome sword that belonged to the legendary Danish king, Hrolf Kraki, which the pronunciation is still up for debate on that one. But according to legends, this is said to be the greatest, best sword that was ever carried in the northern lands, which is one hell of a claim. It was known for its sharpness, for its durability, its strength, as well as being imbued with the spirits of the 12 faithful berserker bodyguards of the king, which is one hell of an enchantment. Imbuing it with 12 berserker guards in one sword. Once again, talk about overpowered. But the sword, according to these sagas, these stories, gets passed down from person to person, and it has a few other kind of quirks or interesting details about it, like it not being able to be drawn in the presence of women, and if it is drawn, it needs to taste blood before it is resheathed, which is an interesting trait. And any wound created by Skofnung cannot ever be healed unless it is rubbed with this particular rock or stone, which was a special stone given alongside the sword, named the Skofnunga stone. Sampo is another artifact from Nordic mythology, this time from Finland, and it was kind of a magical device. There are various descriptions of what this Sampo actually was, from it being a compass to an astrolabe to a chest with a rare artifact inside of it, or a coin, a piece of cloth, a piece of armor. And this isn't at all an exhaustive list of all the items that it could be, as there are many theories regarding it. But the Sampo was said to endow the holder with riches, with food, with water, with fine wines, with little knickknacks, and it was made by the legendary blacksmith Ilmarinen. Ilmarinen then got a ton of bad luck, misfortune, his life was in shambles, so he went on a mission or quest to retrieve his creation, and in one of these battles it was destroyed and sadly lost at sea. The Buddha's Tooth. So we covered this type of artifact in the last Iceberg, I believe. I think it was under Buddha relics or something. But this tooth of the Buddha is one of these Buddha relics. And what happened was, according to legend, the Buddha, or Gautama, died, and his belongings as well as himself, so his body, but also his cups, his mugs, his stick, all of that stuff was burnt down, and the ashes and then various body parts were basically spread throughout all of Asia, and they would serve as blessings for various shrines and temples. And in this instance, his teeth were spread out, and in particular his 4 canine teeth. And they are all currently being kept in 4 different temples around Asia, giving the blessing of Buddha to whoever goes there and worships. Hrunting and Nagling were these 2 epic swords given to Beowulf in the epic poem Beowulf, written in the 8th to 11th century in England, and is actually the oldest surviving English poem or written adventure that we currently have. It was, as I said, written in England in English, but it was set 400 to 500 years before this in Scandinavia, which wouldn't have been too unusual. What with all the Scandinavians and Angles and Saxons going over to England, which is obviously where we actually get the name England from, after the Angles took over. Angleland, England, England. And so it might make sense that after the migration and or invasion of these Nordic people, that perhaps some of their ancestors in England would write a story reminiscing about their ancestors back in Germany or back in Scandinavia or Iceland. And so that is more or less how we likely got Beowulf. And when you read into the abilities of these swords, they are stunningly ineffective, especially when you compare them to the super overpowered legendary weapons we've covered. Nagling, for example, breaks in 2 after a battle or during a battle, because even though the sword is said to be bright, gleaming, sharp, strong, it was noted that Beowulf was just too powerful for the sword. He was just too manly and muscular that when he used the sword, it just broke in 2. Then there is the sword Hrunting, which Beowulf used to fight Grendel's mother at the bottom of a lake, no less. And the sword just didn't work too well, with it being noted that the fabulous power of that heirloom sword ended up failing when Beowulf went to use it, forcing Beowulf to just throw it away. And I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this because it is Welsh, I believe, but Carnwanen was another Arthurian artifact, this time being the dagger that belonged to King Arthur. And it was a fantastic weapon, not necessarily for its offensive capabilities, but the wielder of this dagger was able to turn invisible, making it kind of an invisibility cloak, but instead of cloak, dagger. It is exclusively mentioned in the Welsh Arthurian legends, not the English or the French ones, and is the dagger with which Arthur kills the dreaded witch Ordu by just slicing her in half. So yeah, pretty cool weapon. Ruyi Jinggubang is the magical staff wielded by the immortal Monkey King, Sun Wukong, which, yes, it's an actual thing of actual legends for anyone who's played League of Legends, that horrible toxic game, but the legend behind Sun Wukong and his weapon are really quite interesting. Wukong, in the search for finding a weapon that was worthy of his ability and his capabilities and his strength, he goes to the underwater kingdom of Orguang, where there is a powerful dragon king that rules, and after testing out a bunch of different powerful legendary weapons, swords, spears, halberds. None of them really match up to his power, and so the Dragon Queen suggests that they give him this useless iron pillar that's just been stored, just been lying around in their treasury. And so Wukong goes down into the treasury. He finds this black iron pillar, and it's described as being 20 feet high, as being as thick as a barrel. And Wukong, I guess, just gets it, swings it around, and he thinks to himself, this would be a little more useful, a little more handy if it was like maybe a little thinner, a little shorter. And then this pillar starts to shrink down to the perfect size. And so as he's impressed with this, he kind of looks around the staff that he's made, or that has shrunk down to his perfect size, and he reads some inscriptions on the side of it, saying the compliant golden hooped rod, or it said it in Chinese, but I can't pronounce the Chinese, and it also states the weight of this weapon as 13,500 catties, which, what the hell is a catty? A catty is a unit of weight primarily used in East Asia, roughly equivalent to 1 1/3 pounds or 600 grams. Some areas round to 600 grams, and others have more precise values like 604.78982 grams in Hong Kong. I think that's a little too precise for my liking. But the translated weight is around 8,000 kilograms or 17,500 pounds. And if you remember from the other entry of the legendary Shah dynasty, Yu the Great apparently used this very same weapon to measure the depth of the ocean after the worldwide flood. So he got the staff, put it in the water, and then willed it to grow down to the bottom of the ocean, which is an interesting tying together of different legends. So a very cool piece of Chinese legend. And for those who haven't watched Dragon Ball Z, the main character Goku, or Son Goku, is actually based on the myth and legend of Sun Wukong, with Goku being kind of part monkey, or a particular monkey race, with him using the Nuai Bo staff, which is almost a direct translation of Ryu Bang, and him flying around on a cloud. Just some very cool similarities. The Mask of Tutankhamun is firstly an absolute thing of beauty. I mean, just look at the craftsmanship on this. It was made back in the day in ancient Egypt. It is solid gold with embedded rare gemstones. It's got lapis lazuli in there, great for enchanting, but also some obsidian, turquoise, glass, carnelian, and was made and used as a funerary mask, which was a mask used to put over the face of a pharaoh, or, whoever, before they were buried in their tomb, and it was meant to accompany them in the afterlife. There is an inscription on this mask on the shoulders of the mask, and that inscription is a spell from the Book of the Dead, written there in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The mask itself was discovered in 1925, when British archaeologists discovered the tomb, or rediscovered it. They opened it up, and when doing this, they gazed upon Tutankhamun and his tomb and his mask for the first time in over 3,000 years, which Just imagine how absolutely breathtaking that would be. And breathtaking is actually an interesting choice of words, because we all know about the curse of Tutankhamun, where it was said that it was inscribed in the tomb that whosoever shall open this tomb, or disturb the tomb, or disturb the sleep of the pharaoh, etc., whoever did this would be cursed to die and suffer horribly. And if you're interested in this, there is a whole long list of people who were either at the site, or they helped finance it, or they helped x-ray the tomb. They were just involved in some way with this, and it lists a bunch of their untimely deaths seemingly not too long after. Now, was this all down to a curse? Was this perhaps just a diseased sort of air, a little bacteria or a microbiome within the tomb that after being opened up was unleashed onto the people kind of nearby? Or is it all just a complete coincidence? I will leave that up for you to decide. But if you are ever in Egypt, in Cairo, it is on display in the Museum of Egyptian Artifacts, so absolutely go and check it out.
Dyrnwyn.
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 Dyrnwyn. First of all, sounds awesome. Dyrnwyn. But second of all is one of the 13 treasures of Britain, which is a list of ancient medieval Welsh treasures from mostly the 15th and 16th century. And Dyrnwyn is one of those treasures. We will cover the rest in full further down in the iceberg, as there are some mighty interesting ones. But this was, according to legend, a sword with a white hilt that, when drawn by the right worthy individual, would be engulfed in flames. The sword is in flames, not the person wielding it. That would be a pretty terrible ability. But this sword belonged to Rhywderch. I cannot pronounce this. It is Welsh, and there's a lot of those funny pronunciations going on. But he was called this name, the Generous, and he was named such because he was very generous. So whenever anyone would ask him to borrow this sword, he would say, yeah, go on, here, take the sword. That is until people started figuring out that it went up in flames every time. So then eventually less and less people started asking him for it. But as I said, it is one of the 13 great treasures of Britain, and so we will have to cover the rest of them in the next video. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is strawberry and watermelon tea, and join me as we explore the final deepest, most legendary tier of the legendary artifacts iceberg. In tier 5, we have the Sword of Go-Jin. Now, this weapon honestly is one of the most beautiful swords that I've ever seen. It was expertly crafted, fantastically ancient, and it was made around 2,500 years ago, likely for a Chinese king at the time, and it was found just in 1965, where these archaeological digs were being done near the Jiang River in Hubei, China, and they uncovered this ancient tomb. And then they kept digging more and more around the area and eventually found in this entire section over 50 different tombs. And in those tombs were a total of over 2,000 artifacts, with this sword being one of them. And it's a fairly medium-sized sword. It was found in one of these tombs underwater, and after 2,500 years, it still looks like this. Basically brand new. It still has a very sharp edge on it. It's still patterned all across its blade, still has these engravings on and, embossed with these rare gems. And one of the reasons for this being in almost a perfect condition was the scabbard that it was stored in, which was basically a perfect fit for the sword, meaning the sword was in a more or less airtight environment within the scabbard, and so the other environmental factors didn't really affect the sword as much. The blade itself is mostly made from copper and tin, making this a bronze sword. level 1 noob. But back in these days around this, area of Asia, you often had a lot of Chinese people and craftsmen, etc., traveling to Japan, or vice versa, with the Japanese coming over to the mainland. And they often traded and sold and kind of learned from each other. They got different techniques and different weapons that they could study. And so even with this Chinese weapon, you see a lot of kind of hints of a samurai sword style, with the metal having been kind of repeatedly folded over and hammered down, which contributes to its insanely sharp edge. And it's super interesting, while doing this folding method, they actually ended up with a higher copper concentration in the center of the sword, which, with it being a slightly softer metal, allowed for more, kind of flexibility of the sword, resulting in likely less shattering. And the edges were slightly higher in concentration of tin, allowing for a sharper edge on the outsides. So yeah, just an absolutely gorgeous weapon, as well as being phenomenally crafted, found in crazy circumstances underwater in a tomb thousands of years old. And honestly, if we didn't have actual physical evidence of this sword, it would likely be seen as, just an unbelievable weapon of legends. The sword was loaned out to Singapore in 1994 for an exhibition, but someone working there accidentally kind of knocked the sword against the edge of the case, resulting in a small crack in the sword. And since then, China was like, nope, no longer shall we lend this sword out. Ganjiang and Mo Ye are two names referring to an ancient Chinese blacksmith couple, as well as two of the swords that they created named after them. And their legend and tale is just wonderful and insane. So the story goes that a Chinese king came to this blacksmith couple and he ordered them to make him 2 swords in 3 months. And they had to be like, the best swords because he was a king. But the blast furnace that the couples used wouldn't properly heat the metal. And so in some versions of this, Mo Ye said that there wasn't enough qi or human life force in the furnace. And so she cut off some of her hair, cut off some of her nails, threw them into the furnace in order to increase its chi. And this, I guess, seemed to help. And they also used 300 children to operate the bellows to pump air into the furnace, which, yay for child labor, I guess. Or one version of this tale had Mo Ye actually throw herself into the furnace, like a self-sacrifice in order to increase its chi, which I think that's a little bit dramatic. But in the version where Mo Ye doesn't die, they make these 2 swords in 3 years, not 3 months, and they name the swords after themselves, the Ganjiang and the Mo Ye. But Ganjiang keeps his sword for himself and just gives this king the other sword, the Mo Ye, which this angers the king and he ends up just killing Ganjiang. But Ganjiang predicted that the king might do this, and so before he was killed, he basically took his Ganjiang sword, he hid it somewhere, he left instructions with Mo Ye about its location, about some more information, maybe a, avenging plan, and Mo Ye at the time was pregnant with Ganjiang's kid. So eventually, when this kid Qi is born, after a few years, he grows up, he seeks out his father's sword, the Ganjiang, and he goes basically on a mission to kill this king. But the king this time predicts what this kid is going to do, and he actually sends out an assassin to preemptively kill him. And believe it or not, the story actually gets crazier from here. Just a quick reminder, folks, that we are trying to hit our goal of 50,000 subscribers, and only a small percentage of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So for every subscriber we get on this video, I will be 1% more likely to make another one sometime soon. So the assassin eventually tracks down Qi, he finds him, but after Qi tells him his story, he is so impressed with like the bravery and nobility of it that he says to Qi, look, I'm an assassin, I'm still gonna kill you, but if you just surrender, if you don't make me fight you, if you just give up now and chop off your own head, then I will take your sword, I will take your father's sword, and I will go avenge this king for you. And Qi surprisingly did this. He surrendered, he cut off his own head, and the assassin did actually keep his word. So this assassin then takes Chi's head. He takes it back to the king as like proof that he's killed Chi, and then he suggests to the king that you best boil this head in order to increase decomposition so that basically the head doesn't come back to haunt you. And then the king says like, yeah, that's a pretty good idea, actually. He puts the head in this massive cauldron to boil, but after 40 days of boiling, the head still isn't decomposed. So the assassin says, look, you need to actually look the head in the eyes in order to, like, take away its life force so it can actually start decomposing, which, I don't know if that's scientifically accurate, but we'll move on. And so the king, in trying to get eye contact with this bobbing head in the cauldron, he kind of went by the cauldron, he kind of looked over the edge, he's leaning over the edge of this cauldron, and then when he was fully leaned over, the assassin took this opportunity to slice the king's head off in one clean stroke. And then, as if this wasn't crazy enough, before he was captured, the assassin then just cut his own head off, also over the cauldron, which means all 3 heads were now bobbing around in the cauldron. And I don't know how you cut your own head off with a sword, bit of a weird angle you'd need to hit. But since there were now 3 heads bobbing around in the cauldron, the guards apparently couldn't differentiate between any of the heads. And so they said that all 3 heads should be honored as kings. And they were all then buried in the tomb of the 3 kings. And that is the legend of Ganjiang and Moye. We don't currently know where these swords are today, though they were mentioned several times throughout history as being, found or buried in a tomb, but we just really don't know where any of these tombs or burial places actually are. Caladbolg is a sword in Irish mythology, belonging to the hero and Irish king Fergus mac Roich. And I won't go into the full legend as it is a bit of a long one, but basically Fergus was a king. He wanted to get a bit, frisky, a bit jiggy with a princess named Nessa, and she agreed as long as Fergus let her son Crothair, which, fun fact, Crothair is actually the original Irish form of my name, being Connor, obviously. But as long as Fergus let her son be king for a while, then she basically agreed to get with Fergus. But Crothair became the temporary king, but because he ruled so well as a king, he basically took over the role full time, with Fergus actually being humble enough to realize that Crothair was a better king, and so he said, yeah, you kind of run things better than I do, and he let him be king permanently without any fight, which is pretty reasonable and sensible. But then Crothair wasn't just satisfied with, just being king. He wanted to stamp out all potential competition, and so he put out an order for Fergus to be killed, which, come on, bloody Crothair. He's probably an Aries as well. So Fergus then moved to another kingdom, started getting jiggy with another woman, Queen Maeve. And then Queen Maeve's husband finds out. There's a bunch of drama, a bunch of fighting, and eventually Fergus goes off to fight Crothair, and he basically wins the fight. He's at Caladbolg Point, and he's just about to kill Crothair, and then he gets talked down from it by Crothair's oldest son, and Fergus is just so frustrated. This man tried to kill him, he really wants to kill Crothair, but he just can't get himself to do it, and so in frustration he gets Caladbolg, and he just crazily swings it 3 times, resulting in, according to this legend, the slicing off of 3 tops of hills, accompanied with a kind of cool rainbow effect on the sword, apparently. And that is the legend of Caladbolg. Cortain is apparently just curtain, according to my autocorrect. But no, Cortain was a short sword used by Ogier the Dane, who was a paladin in the Arthur myth. And court is actually the old French word for short, and so it's a short sword called basically short, which is a little handy, I guess. Sword just describes itself. And this is, I guess, one of the more common swords or weapons in the Arthurian tales, as it is featured in, French versions of the Arthurian tales, to Italian versions, to Welsh and British versions. And one of the legends about this sword said that it originally belonged to Sir Tristan, but once Ogier received it, he thought that the sword was too big and heavy, and so he had it shortened and reduced in size, renaming it appropriately Cortain. Cleve Solish, or the Sword of Light, Sword of the Sun, is an ancient sword in Irish mythology. It often appears in lore and tales and myths and legends all over Ireland, with it basically being like a holy grail sort of item, and with it being the, main prize or mission of some ancient quests. And the legend may actually be based on a real sword, but where it currently might be today, long gone and buried, hidden in a tomb, melted down for scrap metal, we kind of have no idea. Shamash's Radiant Axe. So Shamash was the ancient Mesopotamian god of the sun, and was said to be able to see everything that happened in the world all the time. And so because he had all of this knowledge, he was also the top judge in the universe. He was very righteous, passing judgment down on people, that sort of thing. And he was also the protector of travelers. But his weapon, the Radiant Axe, was basically just this immense glowing axe that radiated the divine light and was super powerful. It was able to cut through absolutely anything, and because it was an axe of light, it was able to discern truth from lies, and was actually given to Gilgamesh in some of these ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian legends. The Star of India is this gorgeous sapphire, 563 carats, or 112 grams. That is also one of the largest of its kind in the world. And as you can see, it has this amazing star shape on both the back and the front of the gem. And it is kind of bluish, grayish, cloudy. And this cloudiness is caused by a mineral called rutile within the stone. And it really is a beautiful gem. Its history goes as far back as the 1800s, with it being purchased by an American in Sri Lanka in preparation for a large exhibition, and that is as far back as the actual history goes for the stone, but it is thought to perhaps date back to maybe the 15 or 1600s. It was stolen in 1964, which is a crazy event when you read about it. And basically it was a heist where these thieves came into this museum in the daytime, in just regular opening hours, and they walked around. They didn't attract any attention to themselves, but they went into one of the toilets and left one of the windows a little cracked open. Then they all left, they went home, and after hours, when the museum was then closed, they went to this little window that they had left open, and they used it to gain entry into the museum. Then I guess the museum guards were sleeping or something, as these thieves managed to come in and take many, many priceless gems, like for example the Midnight Star, the DeLong Star Ruby, and the Eagle Diamond. And they found that none of these other gems had alarms on. The only gem with an alarm was the Star of India, but it had run out of batteries, or the batteries on the alarm had died, so when they took it, the alarm didn't even go off. And so the heist was successful. These thieves got away with all of these gems worth an estimated $400,000. And bear in mind, this was in the 1960s, so that would be worth $4 million in today's money. The police eventually caught these thieves: Jack Roland Murphy, or Murph the Surf as he was known, Alan Kuhn, and Roger Clark. But they didn't recover the gems, as they had already been passed off by the time they were captured. And it wasn't until a few months after this that Alan Kuhn was trying to kind of negotiate a lighter sentence, or perhaps no sentence at all. And so he said, look, if you show me some leniency, I will tell you where the gems are. And he eventually did lead them to a bus locker in Miami, where upon opening this bus locker, they did in fact find all of these gems, these insane, rare, hyper expensive gems, just there sitting in the locker. So a wild tale, but the Star of India is absolutely fantastic and absolutely beautiful. The Terracotta Army is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting archaeological finds ever. And it was discovered in the modern day when in 1974, these Chinese peasants were just, digging around. They were digging down for a well, and they stumbled across these little, kind of clay fragments, clay pieces in the ground. So they told, I guess, the government this, and soon a large archaeological dig was undertaken. And what was found in this archaeological dig was just bonkers. Thousands of these life-size, lifelike clay or terracotta soldiers, with most of them being between 5'9" and 7 foot, and with them all being unique in that they had different hairstyles, different clothes, different weapons, and poses, facial expressions. It's just insane. And there were over 8,000 of them. And if that wasn't enough, there was also horse figurines, chariots built down there, entire garden areas with bronze birds. And on top of that, which I know it's hard to imagine even more, but they also at the time would have been painted something similar to this. So as if just being the plain clay soldiers isn't enough, they were also painted likely in unique colors and styles, and likely were all accompanied by actual weapons. Maybe the soldiers own actual swords or shield or daggers, etc. But a lot of these were thought to have been stolen over time because, they were practical. You just steal all the swords, you just melt them down, or just use them if they're new enough. But stealing clay soldiers, can't really do much with that. And so the soldiers themselves were lost to time, as I said, only being rediscovered in the 1970s. But this entire tomb, all of these statues, this entire thing was created for a man named Qin Shi Huang, who was the self-proclaimed first emperor of China. And he was born Yingzheng all the way back in the 200s BC in China. And at the time, he was a prince of one of the 7 kingdoms. He later became full king at the age of 13, and at the age of 22, basically decided to fight all of the other kingdoms and then take them over and then fully unite China under one leadership. And he did. He overpowered them all. He won enough fights to have complete rule and control. And upon declaring himself the emperor and ruler of China, he changed his name to Qin Shi Huang. Qin after his original kingdom, Shi meaning the first, as he was the first emperor, and Huang basically being a reference to these ancient legendary kings of China, adding in some kind of, historical legacy for himself. And honestly, in my opinion, he was both a fantastic ruler as well as a fantastically brutal and cruel leader, more or less a dictator. And so he's kind of a mixed bag. Yes, he took over complete power by force. He defeated and destroyed these other kingdoms. He killed anyone who, went against him. And he actually destroyed a lot of, Confucius texts and Taoist texts because he wanted to unite all of China under something called legalism. So these other religions were in direct conflict with legalism. So yeah, an absolutely brutal figure, but he also did a heck of a lot for China as well. He rooted out corruption. He tried to get the politics as kind of even as possible. He redistributed land as kind of evenly as possible, or as fairly as possible, actually removing and taking land from certain individuals who had too much and spreading it out to peasants, to the common man. He also standardized a bunch of things. So he standardized the currency and the coins. So you didn't have, 10, 15 different currencies, all these different coins, all just floating around China. You just had one currency, a few different coins. He also did this with weights. He standardized the weights so that people didn't have various different weights all around the country. So it's hey, I've got a kilo of carrots. And then you're how much is a kilo in pounds or ounces or some other unit of weight? Flubert or something. But he basically did away with this, had a standardized version of weights, and everyone's individual scales and weights were calibrated to the same ones, so you could be a little more certain that someone wasn't, scamming you, or they had dodgy weights that were giving you, a bit less of their product, etc. He also enforced standardized widths of chariot and cart axles, as well as standard widths of roads and paths, so that basically wherever you went in China and whatever road you took, you were always able to fit your cart or chariot down the road, which sounds pretty smart, sounds pretty sensible. And so yeah, he was a great, and I mean great in terms of powerful, he was a great leader. But after getting all of this power, after accomplishing all of these achievements, he started to get worried that he would lose it all. And specifically, he actually started to fear dying. And so he became obsessed with somehow achieving immortality. He consulted with doctors at the time, with alchemists, with magicians. He drank all sorts of strange concoctions and potions that they said would help him live longer, which ironically likely contained mercury and actually led to him dying sooner. But when he realized that he couldn't really live forever in this life, he started preparing for basically the afterlife. And so that was reflected in him commissioning this entire project, where he had his tomb built in the center, and then surrounding it were these underground clay gardens, complete with, as I said, these bronze statues of birds, and there was likely a lot more stuff there that just simply got lost to time. There were also clay musician statues, so these musicians could accompany him into the afterlife, provide him with comfort and entertainment. There were super expensive items just laid around, gold, precious metals, rare gems, but he ran into a problem in his head, in that, what if I go to the afterlife and all of this stuff that I've prepared just gets taken away from me? And so that is why he had these 8,000 clay soldiers commissioned, crafted by likely these highly skilled craftsmen, in order to basically have a small army accompany him into the afterlife and to protect him there for all eternity. The Imperial Seal of China was created by the man that we just covered, Qin Shi Huang, and after uniting China, he took this jade artifact, which was at the time just a large piece of jade owned by one of these kingdoms, and he used it to carve this heirloom seal of the realm, which basically legitimized someone's rule, as it was obviously a rare artifact at the time, but also it was engraved, it was carved with these words, which translated to roughly, having received the mandate from heaven, may the emperor lead a long and prosperous life. And then, he made all of these clay soldiers. This seal was passed down from dynasty to dynasty, as it was like, if you didn't have the seal, then you couldn't rule China. You'd get revolts all over the place. But it was lost eventually sometime around the 10th century, and we haven't been able to find it or locate it since. The Babylonian map of the world is a very fascinating artifact, and it is this stone tablet discovered in roughly the 1800s, and it is thought to be crafted sometime around the 8th or 9th century BC, so almost 3,000 years ago. And as you can see, this map laid out certain areas, for example, Babylon, Urartu, Assyria, and various other points, a mountain, a swamp, a river, etc., with the river likely being a reference to the Euphrates, and this huge bitter river or ocean, depending on translations, surrounding the entire land, with various regions or these bridges basically connecting this inside land to the divine world outside. And it isn't thought that this is a super geographically accurate map. Yes, you do have actual places, actual cities like Babylon, like Assyria, and the Euphrates River, and this surrounding ocean could be a reference to the, Mediterranean, Black, Arabian, and Caspian seas, which did kind of, in a way, surround Babylon, but obviously not really, as there was loads of land routes through them. But it is thought that this map was probably more symbolic than actually literal, and and this surrounding ocean, or bitter river, was thought to be a Babylonian myth basically separating heaven from earth. And these bridges all around here basically connected the two, with the translated text basically describing various, heroes and different types of animals that live on each island. The third island is where the winged bird ends not his flight. The fourth island is where the sun is brighter than that of sunset or the stars. The fifth island, due north, lay in complete darkness, a land where one sees nothing, not even the sun. The sixth island is where a horned bull dwells and attacks the newcomer, which a bit rude. And the seventh island lays in the east, and this is where the morning dawns, likely because obviously the sun rises in the east. But we don't sadly have captions for the first and second islands, as their descriptions were simply lost to time. There are also these 18 mythological animals, which are kind of reminiscent of our zodiac signs. They were these ancient Babylonian constellations of the stars that, according to legend, used to live on Earth, but the gods banished them away in order to make room for the humans, and for obviously all the other animals that live on Earth. And so in the Babylonian view, this explains why you can see the animals in the constellations in the stars, because they're kind of stuck between us here on Earth and between heaven, which I really like that idea. I think it's quite poetic and creative. But this map overall is, you have Babylon in the center of it, as of course they would make themselves the center. And then you have a few other, local cities, local areas. You have the Euphrates River. And this whole kind of land was basically what was important to them at the time. So it's not, as I said, geographically accurate, but it just represents kind of this is what we care about. And then the rest, the ocean around it, the bridges, etc., that all just represents Babylon and the divide between them and heaven. And I think this website that I'll link down below, but I think they put it really perfectly with this paragraph that reads, "In short, the Babylonian world map can be better understood as the map of the cosmos, symbolically featuring Babylon as the center of the universe, and intentionally connecting them to a higher realm from which they drew meaning for their existence." It's a very interesting artifact that says a lot about the Babylonian myth and legend and culture, so I would highly recommend reading more about it if this sort of thing interests you. The Shield of Ajax. So Ajax was a legendary hero in Greek mythology, featured in, most notably, the Trojan War in Homer's Iliad. He is written as being this huge, powerful warrior with, this deep voice, dark curly hair, and a fierce bravery. And in these epic poems and stories, he's often written as quite a defensive warrior, hence obviously the big-ass shield. He carries this massive shield around, he blocks opponents' paths, he, cuts them off at choke points, but also he defends key areas, important or vulnerable people, and can actually kind of offensively push the opponent back with this big shield. And it is made from 7 cowhides, with the core being made from bronze. So just a fantastic shield. Did it ever actually exist? I mean, maybe, perhaps. And if it did exist, where is it? Once again, we don't really know. But I think it would make for a fantastic find if we do ever dig it up. The Nanjing Belt was found in China in the 1950s, and it was found in a long-lost, buried, forgotten about tomb. So already it's pretty cool. But upon searching this tomb, they found this skeleton just lying there, and kind of scattered around this skeleton, they found these little metal fragments of what they later found out to be the Nanjing Belt. And this skeleton they later found belonged to a man named Zhou Chu, who was a Chinese general in the 200s. And when he died in battle, he was apparently entombed here. He was honored. He had this special belt made for him, and they took it at the time and fastened it basically around his waist. But obviously, over time, because belts are made of leather, the organic material in it started to, decay, to waste away. And so all that were left were these metal fragments. And firstly, it's a pretty gnarly belt. Like, it's quite intricate, it's very well crafted. But as well as all that, they also did some further analysis of the material for this belt, and they found that it was made from silver, from copper, and from aluminium, which is very weird for its time period, because aluminium, especially in this time, was like very, very, very difficult to smelt. And as far as we knew in the modern day, it wasn't even isolated or smelted alone until 1827. And even modern day smelting of aluminium actually takes quite a large amount of electricity because of the method they use for basically isolating it. So it's all very confusing. It was clearly aluminium, it had clearly been smelted, it was part of the belt, but whether this was like a one-off, like a fluke they happened to do, with them kind of smelting it accidentally, or whether they actually had a method for isolating aluminium, but maybe it was just so expensive, so complicated to do, that they more or less never did it except for something like this, honoring a Chinese general. That could possibly be the explanation. But as I said, we didn't even know this until we found the belt, as I guess if they did have this advanced smithing knowledge, it was completely lost to time, completely lost throughout the generations, until we kind of rediscovered it in the 1800s. So yeah, the aluminium side of this is a little bit complicated, super fascinating, but the actual metal, the belt itself, even in its own right, is a super beautiful little piece, and it is immensely well crafted and intricate, and it is definitely fit for a general. In tier 6, we have Jiang Hang's seismoscope, and this was an absolutely insane artifact and invention created by this man Jiang Hang, and he was a Chinese scientist, a mathematician, inventor, engineer, astrologist. He was just everything. He was like an ancient Chinese Leonardo da Vinci, and he was a very, very smart man who lived in like the 1st and 2nd centuries in China. He documented and observed over 2,500 stars, actually creating a star catalog to list them all. He improved the designs of the Chinese water clock, created the first ever water-powered armillary sphere, which was this thing used to help with observing the stars, and he also wrote incredible poetry, which it's like, geez, what couldn't this guy do? But this entry concerns something that he invented, this seismoscope used to detect the direction of earthquakes, which firstly, it just looks absolutely gorgeous, but secondly, it works in a super cool way, where, as you can see these dragons kind of hanging down, they would stick out in these 8 different directions, and within the mouth of each dragon, there would be a little bronze ball. And the whole thing was designed in just the right way, that if there was an earthquake, say, to the north, then this dragon who is pointing north would drop its ball down into the mouth of this frog or toad, and so you would be able to tell that that's where the earthquake was originating from. And yes, it wasn't able to tell how far the earthquake away was or how powerful it was, but just something this intricate and old, almost 2,000 years ago, this invention being able to detect basically where earthquakes were must have just been amazing. And that's not to say anything about the amazing style and design of it. It's like he could have done all of this without the crazy dragon heads and the frog toad thingy, but he did it, I guess, just because he could. And there was actually one occasion where one of the balls kind of fell down, but the people at the time couldn't sense any sort of earthquake. So they thought, oh, this machine must be broken or something. And it wasn't until a while later that they heard of a earthquake in, one of the neighboring cities in that direction. So that's how well tuned in and calibrated it was, that it could detect earthquakes even if the humans couldn't. Shamsher-e Zomorodnega, or the emerald-studded sword, is a sword mentioned in the Shahnameh, which was an ancient Persian legend and poem. And this legend honestly had everything. Everything you would expect from a good legend. It had witches, a mother who basically enchanted her demon son to be immune from all weapons except this one. It has a hero, Amir Arsalan, who goes on a quest, acquires this sword, uses it to defeat this demon. And the sword in some stories used to belong to King Solomon, the guy who owned that ring that we covered in the previous Iceberg. And it was apparently crafted by a man named Kaveh the Blacksmith, who is a legendary figure of his own right in the Persian legend. So it's a great story, a great weapon. We don't know if it ever did actually exist. Hopefully we'll dig up something resembling it sometime soon. But for those interested, it was also featured in Assassin's Creed Mirage. So try and find it in there if you like. And if you do find it, let me know where it is in the comments below. The Green Dragon Crescent Blade is the legendary weapon of this guy, Chinese General Guan Yu from the 3rd century. And there's a whole story about Guan Yu and his adventures, which I won't go fully into, but to kind of summarize, he helped to take over China with Liu Bei until he was eventually captured after, many fights, many battles, and he was executed. But his story and his legend and his achievements were, I guess, very, very popular at the time. And so he was often a symbol of worship and reverence in China. People looked up to him. He was like this legendary warrior, legendary hero. And as often happens a lot with these sorts of things, I think his tales and his stories and, his strength and abilities just kept increasing over time until in the 14th century, the historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms was written, and it told of this legendary weapon, the Green Dragon Crescent Blade, that weighed around 40 to 50 kilos and was difficult, almost impossible for most men to actually even wield it two-handed. But Guan Yu, according to legend, was able to effortlessly wield this weapon with just a single hand. We do have a replica of it, not the actual original, but we have a replica of it displayed in the Purple Cloud Temple in China. But whether he actually owned this weapon, something similar, the original sort of thing, or whether this was a later legendary embellishment, we may never know, but it is still a very cool weapon. Tonbogiri is one of the 3 legendary spears of Japan, created by the legendary blacksmith Sengo Masazain, and wielded by the also legendary Honda Tadakatsu, a general and samurai and warrior. And this Sengo Masazain, the guy who made this spear, interestingly enough, actually went to the Muramasa samurai school, or rather swordsmith school, and we covered Muramasa and a few of his creations in the previous Iceberg, but Muramasa basically founded this school to help teach his craft of swordsmith and weaponry smith, and Masazain was one of the men who attended this school. And then obviously he goes on to create this legendary spear. The name translates to Tonbo, meaning dragonfly, and Kiri, meaning to cut or cutting. And so this spear translates to the dragonfly cutter. And the legend behind it was that it was so sharp that a dragonfly just flew by, as dragonflies tend to do, landed on the spear, and then just with the weight of this dragonfly, the spear cut the dragonfly in half, and so it became known as the dragonfly cutter. Sharur was a weapon meaning smasher of thousands, which is a pretty deadly name, perfect for a weapon of this caliber, I suppose. But it was used by the god Ninurta in the ancient Mesopotamian myths and legends. But as well as being like super smashy and powerful, it could also apparently talk, it could communicate, ideas and strategies and intel to its wielder, and it could fly unimpeded, which reminds me actually a little bit of Thor's Mjolnir. It's written about a fair amount in these ancient myths, and Ninurta uses this weapon to defeat Kur, who was a serpent god, as well as Asag, who was a horrible demon. And this Asag character was so horrible that his presence alone, like literally just him appearing somewhere, would instantly cause fish in all nearby rivers to boil alive. So yeah, some insane lore, but nevertheless a very cool weapon. Fregerar is a sword in ancient Irish mythology, also sometimes known as the Whisperer or the Answerer, and it was capable of some pretty insane feats. It belonged to the first High King of Ireland, Nuada, and featured in these legends about Manannán mac Lir, who was the Irish god of the sea, and a member of the Tuatha De Danann, who were a magical, mythical, godlike people, who we actually briefly covered, I think, in the ancient Rome Iceberg. And as is a common trope with these sorts of weapons, it was known for being incredibly accurate, connecting with and hitting anything the wielder wanted to, and also any wounds caused by this sword simply just wouldn't heal. And with it being called the Answerer, it was also purported to have the ability to basically make people speak the truth. So, like Wonder Woman's lasso. And I think even more impressively, it also had the ability to just, while it was sitting in its sheath, the wearer of the weapon might just be distracted, looking at something else. If the sword itself detected danger, it could literally fly out of its sheath and actually, start swinging itself and attacking the enemies before they even had time to react to it. So yeah, absolutely wild ability, sentient, preemptively attacking sword. Like, honestly, just a fantastic weapon. The Staffordshire Hoard is it is the largest collection of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver, ever discovered, consisting of over 4,000 pieces. It was found in Staffordshire, obviously hence the name, in 2009, and the range of these items within it are just bonkers. There are swords, shields, helmets, daggers, spears, fragments of little bits and bobs, and it's super fascinating to just read through all of the different finds in this. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to take a little look-see. All the items are dated roughly to the 7th century, and the location where this hoard was found in Staffordshire was, at the time in the 7th century, the heart of the Kingdom of Mercia. So these items were all likely deposited there for whatever reason, and then when the kingdom collapsed, stuff got buried down, the kingdom got forgotten about, and life kind of went on until the year 2009, where this was all rediscovered. It truly is a beautiful collection of items if you want to check them out, and it's really quite impressive how so many of them are preserved so well. They still have all the details and the intricacies, etc. on. And if you're ever in England, you can head over to the Stoke Museum to check out a lot of the collection. Venus of Willendorf is this lovely woman, or statue, or figurine that dates back to not 500 years ago, or 1,000, or 2,000 before Jesus, not even 4,000 years ago before the Hebrews, or 5,000 years ago at the time of ancient Egypt, or even 5,500 years ago, which is the oldest written text that we have found. Now, for this statue, we need to go back a lot further than that. So what, maybe 6,000 years ago, before the oldest civilization we know of, ancient Mesopotamia? Nope. Even further back? How about 10,000 years ago, when Sumerians were just these kind of little villages all over the place? No. All of these dates are absolute babies in comparison to the age of this statue, which dates back an estimated 25 to 30,000 years ago, carved from Ulitic limestone and actually colored slightly with clay or ochre, and it was found in Willendorf in Lower Austria in a archaeological dig in 1908. So yeah, such an old relic. It is fantastic to see something like this. It actually resembles a human. It's also crazy to think think how long it survived, and that it hasn't been destroyed or crushed or something in the last 30,000 years. And because this was so long ago, and we don't really have any knowledge of the people's culture back then, or their beliefs, or even a form of rudimentary language, we don't know whether this might have been a representation of like perhaps a god, a local god maybe, or just of a regular human, maybe a character, maybe someone in their village. But regardless, it still is a super fascinating, at least for me, artifact. The Amber Room was a room in the Catherine Palace in St. Petersburg in Russia that was literally an amber room. The walls were decorated and inlaid with gold and amber, and as well as the cost of this room, which must have just been insane, the beauty and awe and light and reflections of it must have just been magical. And it was commissioned by and for King Frederick I of Prussia. But in World War II, during the German invasion of Russia, or rather the kind of partial attempted invasion of Russia, they actually managed to push up as far as this palace, and so basically looted the entire thing. And so the Amber Room is sometimes talked about like, it disappeared, but in reality the Germans just likely came in, stripped all of the gold out of it and all the, rarities and expensive stuff, and then just melted it down, sold it, and pumped it back into their war machine. Obviously, since they're not melting down amber, there is some possibility that, the stuff that they looted from here remains somewhere, that the Germans hid it in a secret underground cave or vault or something, but as of today, no such luck. But in honor of the original, they did actually make a replica in 1979, so you can see modern photos of what this room actually likely looked like. But the original, which we have never recovered, was thought to cost an estimated $150 to $500 million. Just insane. The golden horns of Galahus were these two golden horns made and discovered in Galahus, Denmark, in likely the 5th century AD. Well, they were made in the 5th century AD, but they were found in the 16 and 1700s. And honestly, they look pretty cool. They were originally found not whole, but as like little fragments, and they had to be, a bit repaired and pieced back together until they were eventually stolen in the 1800s and actually were melted down for gold. And so the originals for these horns simply don't even exist anymore. And there were casts made of these horns, which were at the time the only surviving physical evidence of them, until those were lost sometime in the 1800s. And so basically all we have now is drawings and descriptions of these horns, which some people have used to create, recreations or replicas of them. But you can imagine these horns back in the 5th century, being made of gold with these cool, crazy, intricate designs on them. And they were likely used as like a, fancy luxury drinking horn, as luxury horns tended to be, drinking horns. So those made with gold or inlaid with gems, and it was less often for blowing horns to be made from these materials. And even these replicas that we have made in the modern day, they have been stolen and then recovered and then stolen and then recovered. So hopefully they don't get stolen again, but I guess only time will tell. Irminsul of the Saxons. So Irminsul was a sacred pillar or tree that was revered by the Germanic Saxons, likely for at least a few hundred, if not over 1,000 years, until it was sadly, I think, destroyed by Charlemagne in the 700s, as he was trying to, spread Christianity, and so pagan symbols and stuff like this were seen as, kind of competition. They were worshipping this pagan stuff instead of Christ. And so, yeah, he ordered it destroyed, and they built a church basically on top of the site. But we don't know the exact location of this Irminsul, because it's thought that the church wasn't placed exactly where the Irminsul was, but rather like it was symbolically placed over the top of it. So maybe it's, a town over. Maybe it is exactly on top. Maybe it's a few hundred meters on one side or the other. And and the name Irminsul likely refers to a Germanic god, Irmin, who the Germanic people, the Irminones, are named after. And interestingly enough, from this root kind of name and tribe, it kind of morphed into the Herminones and the Hermionones, and eventually the name Hermione. And with regards to the god Irmin, there's not too much detail about him. He was thought to be some sort of a maybe major, but possibly demigod, or was simply another name or aspect for some of the other gods, notably either Odin or Tyr. And as I mentioned, we're not entirely sure whether this was a great pillar of some kind or just a, large great tree, but regardless, it was generally kind of revered and worshipped by the pagans and was likely used for stuff like rituals and events and worship. Until, of course, Charlemagne destroyed it, and that was that. Svalin was this old legendary shield in Norse mythology that sat in front of Sun. Not the sun, by the way, but Sun or Sol, the Germanic god of the sun, which, yeah, it's a little confusing. But this shield would basically block a bunch of sun's light, protecting us humans from the full blast of the sun, which, thank you, Svalin. The Makeup plate is one of the earliest pieces of writing carved into this stone or plate that we have yet found in Russia, or at least the general Russian area. This plate originated and belonged to the ancient Makop people of the North Caucasus, and it was found and uncovered in the 1960s, with it being aged to around kind of 4.5 to 5.5 thousand years old. And the writing on this, because it's so old, is a little bit strange. It's not exactly how we would imagine a language in our modern day. And it was thought to be sort of a middle point between stuff like hieroglyphs, where, you would often draw things. So if you saw 3 cows out there in the field, you would just draw 3 cows. And then it kind of evolved to, cows being represented by a symbol. So you don't need to draw a whole cow. Maybe you can just draw like a little Y shape to represent the horns of the cow or something. Which, do cows have horns? No, bulls have horns. I don't know, maybe you draw like that for the udders or something. But this text is likely thought to be sort of that sort of representation, where the symbols do represent, ideas or items or whatever, but it's not immediately obvious as to what they are. And then obviously in the modern day with something like English, where we have only 26 letters, but we combine them in many different ways in order to form concepts and ideas and things. As I said, we haven't really fully translated this, but there have been attempts at translating it. But as you can see from these 2 translations, which I will put up on the page, and you can pause on each one if you want to read them in full, but you might be able to tell that they are very different from each other, meaning that we really don't have like a definite idea of what this might mean. But if you want to see it for yourself, it is currently being kept in the Ethnographic Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. Or if you just want to take a look at this little screenshot and let me know what you think it means, or you translate it to mean, down in the comments below. The Rockefeller Archaeological Museum is not a reference to an individual artifact, unless like this entire museum is an artifact, but this museum was built with the help and donation of John D. Rockefeller Jr., which was the son of John D. Rockefeller, and he was the insanely rich business and oil tycoon who, through his monopolies, basically ended up being one of the richest people in America and actually one of the richest people of all time. But his son, from being born into such a wealthy family, he decided to be, quite charitable with all of his wealth. And so this was one of the many projects and donations that he made over the years. So he donated around $32 million in today's money in order to build this museum for archaeological finds. And when it was built, it was originally called the Palestine Archaeological Museum and was used naturally to store artifacts and rarities found all over the Middle East, but especially those found in Palestine at the time. But during the 6-day war between Israel and some of the Arab states, Israel managed to win. They managed to capture this land and they took it over. They changed its name from the Palestine Museum to just the the Rockefeller Museum and basically took over all of the artifacts inside of it. One of the most notable being the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we covered, I think, in the previous Artifacts Iceberg. But they took these scrolls and they moved them to the Israel Museum. And I've never been there personally myself, but you can kind of browse online photos of a lot of these artifacts, you know, the ones being kept in the museum, and they are just absolutely fascinating. And also, as a little kind of side note on this, in the rear courtyard of this museum currently resides a stump of a tree, and this tree used to be the oldest pine tree in the entire country until it sadly died in 1998. So really very sad. Tier 7, the 13 treasures of the island of Britain. So if you'll remember, we did cover the first item on this list back in the previous iceberg, that being Dernwyn, or the Flaming Sword. And there are obviously 12 more treasures in this list, which were basically, all in all, the 13 most important legendary mythical artifacts of British and Welsh legend. And I'll quickly go through them all here, but before I do, apologies to all of my Welsh viewers, as I will, with 100% certainty, butcher some of these names. But we have the Hamper of Gwydno Garanir, where when you open it, deposit enough food for one man and then close it. When you opened it again, the food will have multiplied enough to feed 100 men. Pretty handy. The Horn of Bran Galad of the North, which was basically like an infinite drink source. You know, you would just imagine a drink, any drink inside of this, and then it would appear and you would just drink from it. You know, you can do water, coffee, tea, olive oil if you want to be weird, white monster if you're feeling a bit tired, or ginster if you want to offend the entire nation of Ireland. The Chariot of Morgan Winfor, which was basically like a teleportation chariot. You know, you'd climb into the chariot, imagine being somewhere else, and then boom, you would instantly be there. The Halter of Clydno Ideen, where you would wish for any horse you wanted and it would instantly appear, which I think I'm starting to see a pattern with these artifacts. The Knife of Clorforded Farchog, which was a magical dining and feasting knife. The Cauldron of Dernwich the Giant, where if you were hungry and you wanted to eat from the cauldron, you would get it up to a boil, you would add some meat into it, but if you were a coward, this meat would never boil. And if you were a brave or noble man, then the meat would like instantly boil. So it was basically a way of determining whether or not someone was a coward. And I think a little bit inefficient, a bit of a strange one, that one. The Whetstone of Tudwal Teglid, where again, if a coward sharpened his stone on this whetstone, then it would just refuse to cut anyone or draw blood. And if a brave man sharpened his sword on it, then it would draw much blood. And I don't think that's an enchanted whetstone. I think that's like every single whetstone. You know, if a coward gets a sword from a whetstone, because he's a coward, he's not really going to go into many fights, and so the sword's not really going to draw that much blood. But if a brave man sharpens his stone, because he's brave and maybe a bit of a psychopath, he's just going to go out there hacking and slashing. And so yeah, I don't know if you even need an enchantment for this one. The Coat of Padan Baserud, which would always magically perfectly fit someone who is, you know, a noble, but if it was a peasant or something, then this coat would never fit them, which a bit rude. The Crock and Dish of Raiganid was an artifact where any food you wished for or thought of would appear in this dish. And oh boy, we're almost through these, I promise. The Chessboard of Gwendolyn ap Sidio, where if the pieces were set up perfectly on the chessboard, it would actually play with itself. And aside from that, it was apparently quite beautiful, made of solid gold, with the pieces being made of silver. The Mantle of Arthur in Cornwall, which was basically like the invisibility cloak from Harry Potter. The Mantle of Tegor Goldbreast, which basically hung differently off face faithful women as opposed to unfaithful women. So it could be used to put onto a woman and see if they were an adulterer. And that was all of the treasures of the island of Britain, at least according to the legend. Some versions of this list have like 1 or 2 pieces swapped out, but for the most part this is, the main list. And a lot of these items, or mentions of them in like writing and poetry and stories, date back to around the 15th or 16th centuries, but they might have oral traditions that go back even further than that. While some of these artifacts, like for example the Dernwin and the magical hamper, date back to at least the 1100s. This word, which I think is pronounced Wusi Buyunlu, but these were the magical cloud-stepping boots of the Taoist monkey king Sun Wukong. We actually covered his magical staff in the legend in the previous Iceberg, but these boots were woven from lotus fiber and were gifted to him by the Dragon King of the North, basically to make him leave because Sun Wukong was like hanging around, I guess, and the Dragon King was like, look, dude, if I just give you these boots, is that enough? Can you just leave? And Sun Wukong was like, oh, okay, I'll leave. Free boots. And that's not historically or legendarily accurate, but yeah, they are the boots of Sun Wukong. The Ulfbert swords are around 170 swords that were found all over Europe, aging from around the 800s to the 1100s AD, and they all bear the inscription of Ulfbert, and they're honestly really fascinating swords. The name Ulfbert was a Frankish name, meaning they were likely made by and in the Frankish Empire, and we also know that within the Frankish Empire, at around this time, the 800s to 1100s, they had laws forbidding the sale of weapons to foreigners, and this was obviously to prevent them from exporting too many weapons, to a foreign nation or army, and then them using those weapons that they bought in order to defeat the Frankish Empire. But, as I said, we did find these swords kind of all over Europe, which means that they were either bought, on a black market sort of thing, or were stolen or smuggled, or were, won in battle or even looted. And the reason that these might have been, stolen or smuggled were because they were just really good swords. The name Ulfbert isn't thought to be like one guy's name. It was likely what kind of we imagine a brand to be. There's not one guy called like Mercedes making all of these cars, or one dude called Walmart running all of these stores, on the shop floor, refilling all the stuff. These, everyone understands, are brand names, and they generally confer some sort of, reliability in the brand, perhaps, or style that you might like. And this, it is thought, was what Ulfbert represented. There are a ton of them of super high quality, even smithed with crucible steel, which was a very superior steel, better than most European iron at the time, and likely came from the Middle East and Asia, which means they imported it basically halfway across the world in order to smith these super high quality swords in the Frankish Empire. And then I guess because they were so proud of them, they did a little Ulfbert on them. And so it became known, Ulfbert swords are, top quality. So naturally some knockoffs started to be made. And so we do have a fair few Ulfbert swords which are maybe lower in quality or cheap knockoffs sort of thing, but the original genuine Ulfbert swords were likely all built not by one person, but maybe by a family of smiths or a team, like a company sort of thing, or perhaps even just a lineage of smiths. The Aztec Codex, or rather the Aztecs' codices, as there were many of these manuscripts, but these were manuscripts written or rather drawn in a lot of cases, basically using images and paintings and all that to depict ideas, and often to record important events or judgments or historical events, like this one depicting the founding of Tenochtitlan, this place, to something like this depicting a comet that Montezuma spotted in the sky. And there are many of these manuscripts found all over Central and South America, both from before the Spanish invasion and during it and after, giving us kind of an interesting perspective on this invasion, you know, from the indigenous people that were being invaded rather than from the perspective of the Spaniards. And as well as this, a lot of the drawings and manuscripts were used to kind of document different types of medicine and plants, and to keep track of populations and people and wages and debts, etc. But sadly, during the Spanish invasion, a lot of them were destroyed, as the Christian settlers and invaders tended to, you know, burn them whenever they found them, as they thought it was stuff of witchcraft or heresy or blasphemy, which is sad, but a bunch still did manage to survive, which is how we still know of so many of them. The Cave of Altamira is this huge cave system in Spain that is filled with these very ancient paintings, some of which, actually a bunch of which, look really, really cool, like they're done with charcoal and iron dust and clay dust for like different colors. And if you look at some of them, they've actually got like, you know, shadings and shadows, making them look kind of 3D, which I think is very cool. But they were made by humans around about 36,000 years ago. They were discovered in the mid-1800s when a tree basically fell on, you know, part of the cave and revealed an opening. And then they, you know, went through, dug it out, discovered these inside caves. And from carbon dating and tests, it was determined that humans had basically used these caves as a place to live, for shelter, and apparently, you know, for art and stuff from about 18,000 years ago. And then there was a break of like a few thousand years where only really animals used these caves. And then humans used them again from around 16 to 14,000 years ago. And then not long after that, for some reason, one of the caves collapsed, which basically sealed off the entire cave system, restricting entry into it and preserving everything inside of it until we rediscovered it in the 1800s. They also, as well as these paintings on the walls and ceilings, found ancient stone tools, daggers, spearheads, even needles and harpoons made from like bones, and stuff like jewelry and evidence of these rudimentary ancient fireplaces. Tier 8, Silphium. So Silphium is a very interesting entry, and this was actually a plant or herb that was used in the ancient world, sometimes referred to as laser or laserwort, and it was used in everything from like seasoning to perfume to treating ailments like as a medicine, to even in some cases spicing up people's bedroom life, if you know what I mean. But the unusual thing about this plant is that we don't really know what it was. Like, we have found many mentions of it, so it clearly did exist, and there are descriptions of it and even depictions of it, with Rome and Greece notably importing fairly large amounts of it, and it grew at least partly in northern Africa. But it is thought to have gone extinct over the years, and likely even went extinct during the time of the Romans. But through kind of modern analysis of the description of this plant and some of its attributes, we've kind of determined that it likely might be of the carrot family, you know, something similar to a fennel sort of thing. And it is thought that it only actually went extinct because of how popular it was, which basically led to overharvesting of the plant, as well as some temperature and geographical changes in where it was grown. So yeah, a wonderful, cool little plant, a very useful plant that sadly is no more. Ancile was an ancient shield that, according to legend, fell down upon Rome, and it was sent down by Jupiter, the god, not the planet. Because planets are incapable of making shields, they simply lack the arms and the opposable thumbs to make stuff. But it was sent down, according to legend, by Jupiter, and it was basically proof that the gods had given their blessing to Rome to basically rule the entire world, and that if the shield was ever lost, stolen, or destroyed, that this would kind of void the warranty and they wouldn't have the blessings of the gods anymore. And so when this happened during the reign of Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, he thought that it was was so important, absolutely priority to keep this shield safe, and so immediately he had ordered some smiths to make 11 identical shields to this shield. And so the idea was, if you had these 12 shields, you know, if someone came to steal them or destroy them, they wouldn't be able to tell which shield was actually the real one. And so I guess it would lower the chances of it ever being stolen. Krishna's chakra is once again just an OP weapon, which was a disc belonging to the Hindu god Krishna. And it could do everything from, you know, being used as a weapon, chopping off people's heads, to defeating demons and evildoers, to cleansing people, to rebalancing their cosmic dharma, to protecting people with these, you know, protective enchantments, or to just be used as a shield, to even being used to block out the sun, or in forcing people to tell the truth, like some sort of a truth serum. The chakra or disc itself was kind of a representation of time, as it was constantly spinning round, you know, just like time constantly goes on and on and on. And this can join the long list of just incredibly broken OP weapons. The Rohonk Codex is a book or manuscript or codex that was found in the 1800s in Hungary, and it is written in an unknown language by an unknown author with basically an unknown meaning. And there are these strange depictions on a bunch of the pages, which there are 448 pages in total, and written in here are 792 unique symbols, suggesting that these may not be letters like in our alphabet, where, you know, we can rearrange them to mean different things, but maybe something closer to, you know, the Chinese language, where one symbol, one letter, can mean one individual thing. They dated the paper that it was written on to around like the 1500s, but as I said, as to its origin, as to its author or its meaning, or even to its authenticity, as it could likely be a hoax, we currently have no solid answer. And that is all we have time for. This was a super fun video to make, to research. A bunch of these entries are from all of you guys who suggested them in the comments of the previous videos. So thank you all for that. I may make another one of these in the future if there is enough interest or want or need for it. You know, any more obscure or cool or interesting artifacts which I haven't covered already, just pop them in down below and we'll see how many we can rack up. But until the next video, take care of yourselves, drink plenty of water, get plenty of sunlight, although not too much sunlight, and as always, thanks for watching.